Welcome, dear listener, to another episode of Boring History. Wherever you are right now, whether you're nestled under blankets in Chicago, staring at the ceiling in Manchester, or watching headlights drift across your bedroom wall in Sydney, I'm glad you're here. If you find yourself drifting off during this video, well, that's rather the point. But before you do, consider hitting that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, helps the channel immensely, and ensures you'll have plenty more historical journeys to ease you into sleep on future nights. Tonight we're going to explore a world of fire and iron, of smoke and suffering, of craftsmanship purchased at the cost of human flesh. We're going to step into the workshop of a Viking Age weaponsmith, and discover why, despite the romance we've attached to these master craftsmen, their lives were exercises in prolonged misery that would break most modern people within days. When you visit a museum and see a beautifully preserved Viking sword behind glass, the pattern-welded blade with its subtle waves of metal, the carefully shaped fuller running down the centre, the elegant crossguard, you're looking at an object of genuine beauty. We stand there and admire the artistry, the skill, the almost magical ability of ancient craftsmen to transform raw earth into implements of both utility and art. The museum placard might tell you the sword dates to the 9th century, perhaps that it was found in a Norwegian burial mound or dredged from a Danish harbour. What it doesn't tell you is the cost. Picture, if you will, the man who made that sword. Imagine his workshop, a dim, cramped structure thick with smoke, the air shimmering with heat that makes every breath feel like swallowing fire. Imagine his hands, so scarred and calloused that they barely look human anymore, missing fingertips, permanently curved from decades of gripping hammer and tongs. Imagine his face, prematurely aged, his eyes damaged from staring at white-hot metal for 30 years, his lungs so corrupted by metal fumes and charcoal smoke that every winter might be his last. Imagine him working 14 hours a day in conditions that would violate every occupational safety regulation ever written, creating objects of death while slowly dying himself. Tonight, we're going to spend over 2 hours exploring why it sucked to be a Viking weaponsmith. We'll walk through every aspect of their brutal craft, the toxic forge environment, the crushing economic pressure, the religious burden, the physical destruction, the psychological weight of creating instruments of death. We'll examine the hierarchy of metal workers, the fate of slave smiths, the environmental cost of their fuel needs, and the various ways their profession could destroy them. This isn't a story of noble craftsmen pursuing their art. This is a story of human beings trapped in a brutal occupation that ground them down day by day, year by year, until they were used up and discarded. So settle in, get comfortable, let the light from your screen be the only illumination, much like the forge fire was often the only light in a smith's workspace. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps spare a thought for those anonymous craftsmen whose suffering we've forgotten, but whose work we still admire 1,000 years later. Let us begin. To understand the world of the Viking Age weaponsmith, we must first situate ourselves in time and place. We're speaking primarily of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the Norse-settled regions of Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and parts of the British Isles, during what historians call the Viking Age, roughly 773 to 1066 CE. These 3 centuries saw the dramatic expansion of Norse culture across Europe, their raids and settlements reaching from Constantinople to Newfoundland, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. But while Viking warriors sailed forth seeking glory and plunder, someone had to stay behind and make the weapons that made such ventures possible. The weaponsmith occupied a peculiar position in this society, essential to its military culture, yet bound to his workshop, his forge, his anvil. While jarls and warriors could seek their fortunes across the seas, the smith remained, breathing smoke, swinging his hammer, transforming iron into the tools of other men's glory. Geographically, Smiths could be found in virtually every Norse settlement of any size. Archaeological evidence reveals smithing sites from Dublin to Novgorod, from Uppsala to Reykjavik. But these weren't industrial centres by any modern measure. A typical Viking Age smithy was a modest structure, perhaps 4 by 6 metres if the smith was fortunate, often smaller. Many were partially sunken into the earth for temperature regulation, with walls of wood, wattle and daub, or in rare cases stone. The roof inevitably had an opening for smoke, never quite large enough, leaving the interior in a perpetual haze. The climate of Scandinavia added its own particular cruelties. Long dark winters where temperatures plunged well below freezing meant the smith worked in a bizarre microclimate. Scorching hot near the forge, bitterly cold everywhere else in the workshop. Summer brought some relief from the cold, but introduced the torture of working in intense heat with no respite. The smith couldn't take breaks when it suited him. The rhythm of metalwork doesn't accommodate human comfort. Iron must be worked at precise temperatures, bronze and copper even more so. The metal commands and the smith obeys, regardless of whether it's the dead of winter or the height of summer. This was also a world of scarce resources and difficult logistics. Iron wasn't mined in the modern sense. It was harvested as bog iron from marshes and wetlands, a labour-intensive process that yielded relatively small quantities of usable metal. Quality iron was expensive. Steel was even more precious, produced through countless hours of repeated heating, hammering and folding to distribute carbon throughout the iron. A single sword might represent months of work and materials worth more than most farmers earned in a year. Viking Age Scandinavia was a warrior culture, but more specifically, it was a culture obsessed with weaponry. A man's worth was measured in part by the quality of his weapons. Swords had names, Tyrfing, Skofnung, Grammar, and were passed down through generations as prized heirlooms. The sagas are filled with elaborate descriptions of weapons, their appearance, their history, their almost mystical qualities. To own a fine sword marked you as a man of substance. To own a poor one marked you as lesser. This cultural obsession created enormous pressure on the smiths who produced these weapons. They weren't simply making tools, they were creating objects bound up with their client's identity, honour and survival. A warrior's life might depend on whether a sword held its edge in battle, whether a shield's boss was properly forged, whether an axe head was properly seated on its haft. The smith bore responsibility for outcomes he could never predict or control. He could craft the finest blade possible, but if the warrior who wielded it fell in battle, would the smith be blamed? Sometimes, yes. The social position of smiths was peculiar. Respected but not elevated, valued but not wealthy, seen as possessing semi-magical abilities yet still bound to manual labour. In the Norse mythological tradition, smithing had divine associations. The dwarves, greatest craftsmen of all, forged the gods' treasures, Thor's hammer Mjolnir, Odin's spear Gungnir, Freya's ship Skidbladnir. The god Völundr, Wayland in English tradition, was himself a master smith, though his legend is one of suffering, enslavement and revenge. The mythology suggested that smithing was a kind of magic, a transformation of base materials into something greater through secret knowledge and skill. But mythology didn't pay for fuel or food, and it didn't protect smiths from the very real hazards of their craft. Whatever respect Norse society accorded to smiths was abstract and conditional. A smith who produced quality work reliably might be valued. One who failed, for any reason, could find that respect evaporating instantly. The smith existed in a state of perpetual proving, each commission a test that could result in reward or ruin. The economics of smithing trapped most practitioners in perpetual precarity. The raw materials were expensive, the fuel consumption enormous, the tools themselves costly to produce and maintain. A smith needed an anvil, hammers of various sizes, tongs, files, chisels and a functioning forge. These represented significant capital investment. Many smiths worked their entire lives without ever truly owning their means of production. They were perpetually in debt to suppliers, to patrons, to anyone who could advance them the silver they needed to continue working. Moreover, the market for weapons was both essential and unstable. In times of peace, demand might slacken. In times of war or raiding season, demand could surge beyond any one smith's capacity to meet it. But the smith couldn't simply scale up production. He was limited by his own two hands, the hours in a day, the physical toll of the work. He couldn't stockpile extensively because the capital tied up in finished weapons represented silver he desperately needed. The smith walked a perpetual economic tightrope with nothing to catch him if he fell. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to systematically dismantle the romantic image of the Viking Age smith and replace it with something closer to the truth. We'll examine 25 different aspects of their craft and existence, each revealing another layer of difficulty, danger, or misery. This isn't to say that smiths didn't take pride in their work or find moments of satisfaction. They surely did. But we must understand the full cost of that craft, the price paid in flesh and health and years of life. The thesis we'll be exploring is this. To be a Viking Age weapon, smith was to accept a life of chronic suffering in exchange for bare survival and conditional respect. It was to breathe poison every day, to burn yourself repeatedly, to destroy your body incrementally over decades, to bear psychological burdens that would break many modern people, all while existing in economic precarity with minimal social safety net. It was to be essential to your society's military function while personally benefiting very little from that society's military successes. It was to create beauty and death in equal measure, to transform earth into art, into instruments of killing, and to carry that strange alchemy in your lungs and on your hands until it finally killed you. We'll look at the physical environment, the forge's scorching heat, the toxic smoke, the fire danger, the seasonal extremes. We'll examine the actual work, the repetitive strain, the learning process, the technical demands, the economic pressures. We'll explore the social dimensions, the hierarchy among smiths, the relationship with violent clients, the competition and sabotage, the special suffering of enslaved craftsmen. We'll consider the physical toll, the burns, the deformities, the lung damage, the hearing loss, the premature aging, and we'll contemplate the psychological weight, the pressure of lives depending on your work, the guilt of creating death tools, the fear of failure, the slow recognition that your craft is destroying you. This is not a story of heroes or villains. The smiths weren't saints, and their clients weren't monsters, or rather, they were all simply people, trapped in the particular brutalities of their time and place. What we're examining is a system, an occupation, a way of life that extracted an enormous human cost for the iron implements that made Viking Age society function. Every sword in a museum, every axe excavated from a burial mound, every spear point found in a battlefield represents human suffering we've forgotten. As we move through each chapter, you might find yourself drifting towards sleep. That's entirely appropriate. Let the information wash over you. Let the rhythm of the narration ease you into rest. The smiths themselves rarely had that luxury. Their sleep was often fitful, interrupted by coughing, by pain in damaged hands, by the anxiety of unfinished commissions or unpaid debts. But you can rest. You can let this history lull you gently into dreams while remembering perhaps that the past was never as romantic as we imagine, and that every artifact we admire came at a price. Let us now turn to our first chapter and enter the forge itself. Chapter 1. The Forge. A place of fire and suffering. Picture, if you will, walking into a Viking Age smithy on a typical working day. Before your eyes can adjust to the dimness, the heat strikes you. A physical wall of scorching air that makes you instinctively step back. The temperature near the forge itself reaches 40 degrees Celsius or more, even before the fire is stoked to working intensity. Once the bellows begin their rhythmic wheezing and the charcoal begins to glow, the temperature at the heart of the forge climbs to 900 degrees Celsius, sometimes reaching 1200 degrees for specialised work. Standing 3 feet from such heat for hours at a time is almost unimaginable to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The smoke is the next assault. Charcoal smoke fills the workshop, thick and acrid, coating the inside of your throat and lungs with every breath. The smoke opening in the roof, always too small, always in the wrong place depending on wind direction, provides minimal relief. On still days, the smoke simply hangs in the air like a grey fog, reducing visibility to a few feet. Your eyes water constantly, your throat burns, and this is just visiting for a few minutes. Imagine breathing this air for 12, 14 hours a day, year after year, decade after decade. The light is perhaps the most disorienting element. Most of the workshop exists in perpetual gloom, lit only by the forge fire itself, and perhaps a small oil lamp if the smith can afford such luxury. But the forge fire, once properly hot, blazes with an intensity that's almost blinding. The smith must work by this contrast, deep shadow broken by searing brightness. He must stare at white-hot metal to judge its temperature precisely, to know the exact moment when it's ready to work. The Viking Age smith had no pyrometers, no temperature gauges, no technological aids. His eyes were his instruments. What made this truly brutal was the cumulative effect on vision. Modern metallurgists wear darkened visors or special protective glasses when working with hot metal. The Viking Age smith had no such protection. He stared directly at metal heated to incredible intensity, day after day, year after year. The result was predictable. By their late 30s or early 40s, many smiths suffered significant vision problems. Some went partially blind, able to perceive light and shadow but losing fine detail. Others developed what we might recognise as severe cataracts. A few went completely blind. There's evidence in the sagas of this phenomenon, though it's presented without much comment. References to old Stein who works by touch alone, or to smiths whose sons or apprentices must guide the final detailed work. Archaeological examination of skeletal remains identified as smiths sometimes shows patterns consistent with visual impairment. Wear patterns on teeth suggesting they were used for tasks normally done by hand with fine vision, for instance. The master smith Thorstein, mentioned in a 12th century Icelandic genealogy, was noted as blind from the forge yet still working, when he died in his forge at age 46. His life continued past the death of his eyesight, but the work didn't stop simply because he could no longer see properly. So the next time you complain about harsh fluorescent lighting in your office, or the glare on your computer screen, remember the smith standing in near darkness staring at metal that glows like a captive sun, knowing that every day brings him closer to blindness, but unable to stop because stopping means starvation. OSHA regulations mandate proper lighting, eye protection, ventilation systems. The Viking Age smith had none of it. He simply endured. Chapter 2. The Price of Iron, Blood and Broken Backs. The gleaming sword behind museum glass begins not in the forge but in the bog. Viking Age Scandinavia had minimal access to mined iron ore. Instead, smiths relied primarily on bog iron, a form of iron that precipitates out in wetlands and marshes where iron-rich groundwater meets organic material. This process creates nodules and layers of limonite and other iron compounds in the boggy soil, which could be harvested, processed and smelted into workable iron. It sounds almost quaint when described in a textbook. Harvesting bog iron, as if you were picking apples. The reality was back-breaking labour in miserable conditions. Bog iron extraction required wading into marshes, often chest-deep in frigid, murky water, probing with long poles to locate the iron-rich layers beneath the water and organic muck. Once located, the material had to be dug out, spade work in cold water, filling baskets with heavy waterlogged sediment. Each basket weighed 30 to 50 pounds when full of water-saturated material. These baskets had to be carried out of the bog up onto solid ground, transported to processing areas. A single smelting operation might require hundreds of such baskets. The work was cold, wet, exhausting, and dangerous. Bogs are treacherous places. The ground is unstable, false. What appears solid might give way into deep water or sucking mud. Every step is uncertain. The cold water itself presented a constant hazard. Even in summer, bog water rarely warms significantly. Standing in it for hours could lead to hypothermia, to loss of sensation in your legs and feet, to dangerous mistakes when your body stopped responding properly. What made this process truly horrific was who did most of this work. While free smiths might oversee the operation, much of the actual labour fell to thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage. For thralls, bog iron extraction was among the worst labour assignments imaginable. They worked in chains or with leg shackles in some cases, making movement through the treacherous bog even more dangerous. They had little incentive to care for their own safety. They received minimal food regardless of output, and their lives were considered expendable property. The drowning rate was significant. A thrall loses his footing in deep water. The heavy iron-laden basket pulls him down. The chains prevent him from freeing himself or swimming to safety. Or the cold takes him, hypothermia setting in, his strength failing, his body giving out in the frigid water. Archaeological investigations of some bog iron extraction sites have revealed human remains, bodies that were likely left where they fell, abandoned in the same bog from which they were harvesting iron. The iron was valuable enough to retrieve, the slave was not. Even for those who survived the extraction, processing bog iron was its own ordeal. The harvested material had to be dried, broken into smaller pieces, roasted to drive off water, and begin reducing the iron compounds. Only then could it go into the smelting furnace, where perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of the starting material's weight emerged as usable iron bloom. It might take 200 pounds of bog iron material to produce 50 pounds of usable metal, which might in turn become 1 or 2 sword blades. So when you see a Viking sword, understand, before the skilled smith ever touched it, someone, often many someones, had stood chest deep in cold bog water, had carried countless heavy baskets, had risked drowning and hypothermia, had breathed the caustic smoke of roasting furnaces. Some of those people died in that process. Their names are forgotten. Their bodies may still be in the bogs, but their labour is in every artefact, and we never think of them at all. Chapter 3. The Apprentice's Nightmare. Learning through pain. Becoming a Viking. Age weapon, Smith required roughly 7 to 10 years of apprenticeship, and the process began horrifyingly young. Boys as young as 8 or 9 were bound to master smiths, sometimes through family connections, a father passing his trade to his son, but often through formal arrangements where the boy's family paid the master smith in silver or goods to take the child. Once bound, the apprentice belonged to the master for the duration of the agreed term. He lived in the master's household, worked at the master's command, and had essentially no rights. The working day for an apprentice was brutal. Up before dawn to stoke the forge fire back to life from the banked coals of the night before, prepare the tools, sort materials, fetch water, haul charcoal. And then, once the master began his work, the apprentice's real labour began, pumping the bellows, hour after hour, maintaining the rhythmic squeeze and release that kept air flowing into the forge, keeping the fire at working temperature. A young boy might spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day just working the bellows, his arms burning with fatigue, his hands blistering from the repeated motion. Burns were considered an essential part of learning. "You'll learn to respect hot metal" was apparently a common sentiment, according to saga references to smith training. And the apprentice learned through pain, touching metal he thought had cooled, reaching too close to the forge, failing to move quickly enough when the master handed him hot stock. The scars accumulated. Small burns on the hands and arms, larger ones occasionally. These scars were proof of experience, proof that you'd endured. An older smith's hands were topographic maps of accumulated burns, some shallow, some deep, some that had healed clean, others that had left permanent tissue damage. What made this darker was that the learning through pain wasn't always accidental. Masters varied in their temperament and teaching methods, but some used deliberate burns as punishment or emphasis. An apprentice who repeatedly made the same mistake might find his master accidentally knocking a piece of hot metal against the boy's hand, or calling him to take a tool from the fire before it had cooled sufficiently. This wasn't recorded in any systematic way. It was simply understood as the way of things, the necessary harshness that forged a capable smith from raw material. Failed apprentices faced a grim future. Not every boy who began smithing training succeeded. Some lacked the physical strength, others the fine motor control for detailed work. Still others simply couldn't endure the conditions or master the enormous body of technical knowledge required. For freeborn boys, a failed apprenticeship meant social humiliation and limited options. They might become labourers, farm hands, sailors if they were lucky. For boys of lower social status or those whose families had paid heavily for the apprenticeship, the consequences could be worse. Some were sold into thraldom to recoup the master's investment in their training. Others were simply turned out with nothing, no trade, no prospects, no future. Consider a boy named Einar, mentioned briefly in a 13th century Icelandic text. He entered apprenticeship at age 9 to a master smith named Thorfinn. At age 15, after 6 years of training, Einar still couldn't master the precise timing required for proper tempering, the critical process of heating and cooling steel to give it hardness and flexibility. Thorfinn's teaching methods apparently included pressing, heated iron against Einar's forearm when he aired, so the boy would remember the proper heat by the feel. Einar bore these scars the rest of his life. When he was 17, Thorfinn declared him unteachable and released him from apprenticeship with no certification of skill. Einar ended up as a farm labourer, his 8 years of suffering and accumulated burns meaning nothing. So when we marvel at the skill of ancient craftsmen, remember, that skill was purchased with the suffering of children, some of whom broke under the training and were discarded as failures. We call it apprenticeship. In many ways, it was institutionalised brutalisation that happened to produce skilled craftsmen from among the survivors. Those who couldn't survive it simply don't appear in the historical record. Chapter 4. The Weight of Expectation. When lives depend on your work. Imagine doing a job where your smallest mistake might kill someone. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract way, but directly and personally. The weaponsmith lived with this reality every working day. The sword he crafted would go into battle. The axe head he forged would be raised against shields and helmets and flesh. The spear point he shaped would be thrust into someone's body. And if his work was flawed, if the metal had a hidden crack, if the tempering was inconsistent, if the construction was subtly weak, then the man wielding that weapon might die because of it. The psychological pressure of this was immense. A sword that breaks in battle doesn't just fail as a tool, it becomes a death sentence for its wielder. Picture a warrior in the chaos of combat, his sword suddenly snapping in half as it strikes an opponent's shield, leaving him holding a useless handle while his enemy's weapon descends. That moment of shock, of disbelief, and then death. Every smith knew this was possible. Every smith had probably heard stories of weapons failing, of warriors dying because their equipment betrayed them at the critical moment. The technical challenge of preventing such failures was enormous given the materials and methods available. Viking Age steel was inconsistent by nature. The smith was trying to distribute carbon throughout iron through repeated heating, hammering, and folding. A process that worked but left potential weak spots, inclusions, areas where the metal hadn't bonded properly. The smith could inspect his work, test it, examine it carefully, but he could never be truly certain. Microscopic flaws invisible to the naked eye could become catastrophic failures under stress. What made this truly brutal was the social and economic consequences when weapons failed. The smith might face retaliation from the dead warrior's family. Norse society operated on principles of honour and compensation. When someone died, his family was owed weregild, compensation for the loss. If the death could be attributed to faulty equipment, the smith who made that equipment might be held responsible. He might owe silver he didn't have, livestock he didn't own, land he'd never possessed. The debt could be crushing, potentially generational. There's a saga account of a smith named Bjorn the Dark who forged a sword for a young warrior named Hakon. The sword was reportedly beautiful, well balanced, with excellent edge retention. Hakon carried it proudly. 6 months later, during a dispute that turned violent, Hakon drew his sword to defend himself. On the third or fourth strike, the blade shattered halfway down its length. Hakon was killed moments later. His older brother, a man of some wealth and status, held Bjorn responsible. The brother demanded either weregild for Hakon's death or compensation in the form of service and goods. Bjorn had neither the silver nor the resources to pay. The resolution, according to the saga, was that Bjorn's daughter was given in marriage to Hakon's brother without dowry, essentially as human compensation for the failed sword. Imagine living with that possibility hanging over every commission. Imagine the smith testing his blade, examining it from every angle, knowing that no matter how careful he's been, he can't be certain. Imagine handing over a completed sword and feeling not just pride but also dread, hoping desperately that it will serve its purpose, that it won't fail, that it won't kill the man who's paying you, and then destroy your family in the aftermath. This wasn't occasional anxiety. This was the constant undercurrent of the smith's professional life. The modern equivalent might be a structural engineer, knowing that if a building they designed collapses, they'll not only lose their license and face lawsuits, but potentially see their daughter forced into marriage with a victim's family. We've separated professional liability from personal catastrophe in the modern world. The Viking Age smith had no such protection. His work failures were personal failures, and the consequences could be absolute. Every hammer strike carried that weight. Chapter 5. The Toxic Trade. Poison in every breath. The forge fire that made smithing possible was also slowly killing every smith who worked near it. Modern occupational health studies of traditional metalworking have revealed the staggering toxic load that smiths absorbed, and the Viking Age smith had it worse than most historical metalworkers, because he had absolutely no understanding of what was happening to him or why, and no protective equipment whatsoever. The charcoal smoke itself was bad enough. Carbon monoxide, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds released from the burning wood-derived fuel. Breathing this day after day scarred lung tissue, reduced oxygen capacity, left smiths chronically short of breath. Many developed what we'd recognise as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or similar conditions by their 30s. The characteristic smith's cough was recognised even in the Viking Age, mentioned in several sagas as a distinctive trait of the profession, a wet, hacking cough that never quite went away and got progressively worse over the years. But the smoke was just the beginning. Metalworking releases metal fumes when materials are heated to high temperatures. Iron and steel working produces iron oxide fumes. More dangerous were the alloys and special materials. Bronze work, common for decorative elements, some tools and earlier weapon traditions that persisted, released copper fumes and often zinc fumes if brass was involved. Copper fume exposure causes metal fume fever, a condition the Viking Age smiths knew well, though they didn't understand its cause. The symptoms came on suddenly after exposure. Violent shaking and chills, fever, severe headache, nausea, metallic taste in the mouth. the smith would be incapacitated for hours or days. With repeated exposure, the effects could be fatal, organs gradually failing under toxic metal accumulation. Lead was everywhere in metalworking, used in some alloys, sometimes in solders, released as a contaminant in various ores. Lead poisoning is insidious because it accumulates. Early symptoms are subtle: fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating, stomach problems. As it progresses, severe abdominal pain, cognitive impairment, tremors, anemia. The Viking Age smith experiencing these symptoms had no way to connect them to his occupation. He might think himself cursed, or ill from other causes, never realising that every day at the forge was depositing more lead in his bones and organs. Perhaps most insidious was silicosis from grinding and polishing work. Sharpening blades, smoothing surfaces, finishing pieces all involved abrasive materials, grinding stones, polishing compounds, sand. These created fine silica dust, invisible to the naked eye, but devastating to lung tissue. Silica particles lodge in the lungs and cause scarring, progressive difficulty breathing, and eventually complete respiratory failure. The process takes years, even decades, but it's irreversible. Once enough scar tissue has formed, the lung simply can't function. The smith drowns in air, gasping for breath that won't satisfy, his lungs rigid and useless. What made all of this truly nightmarish was the complete lack of understanding. The Viking Age smith felt himself weakening, felt his breath growing short, felt his body failing, and attributed it to age, to ill luck, to divine disfavour. He had no concept of occupational disease, no understanding that his trade itself was the culprit. Some sagas mention smiths who believed themselves cursed by spirits angry at their metalworking. The fire spirits, who lived in the forge and punished those who displeased them. In a sense, they were right. Invisible forces in the fire were indeed killing them. They just weren't spirits. They were particles and fumes and poison. Archaeological studies of Viking Age skeletal remains identified as smiths show characteristic markers of heavy metal poisoning, respiratory disease, and other occupational hazards. One Norwegian site yielded the remains of 3 men buried near a smithing operation, all showing severe lead poisoning, silicosis markers in bone structure consistent with respiratory disease, and death in their 30s or early 40s, young men with bodies that look elderly from chemical assault. Their craft consumed them from the inside, and they never knew why. So when OSHA mandates respirators, fume hoods, exposure limits, and monitoring for occupational hazards, remember, these protections exist because people died. Thousands, millions of people across history, breathing poison every working day. The Viking Age smith was simply one more victim of a system that valued the product more than the producer, the sword more than the hands that made it. Chapter 6. The Rhythm of Endless Repetition. There's a particular kind of madness that comes from doing the same physical motion thousands of times, day after day, year after year. The Viking Age weapons, Smith knew this madness intimately. Creating a quality sword blade wasn't a matter of inspiration or artistic vision. It was brutal, mechanical repetition. Heat the metal in the forge, remove it at precisely the right temperature, strike it with the hammer, rotate, strike again, rotate, strike. The metal cools. Return it to the forge, heat again. Remove, strike, rotate, strike. Hundreds of times, thousands of times, for a single blade. A well-made pattern-welded sword blade required somewhere between 200 and 300 hours of actual smithing work, not counting the time for handles, guards, pommels, and finishing. That's 200 hours of the same motions, the same rhythm, the same endless cycle of heat strike, heat strike, heat strike. The repetitive strain on the body was catastrophic. The shoulder that swung the hammer developed characteristic damage. Torn rotator cuff muscles, arthritis in the joint, bone spurs that ground together with every movement. By their 30s, Most smiths had permanent damage to their dominant shoulder that caused constant pain. The hands suffered even more comprehensively. Gripping the hammer for hours every day thickened the tendons, caused the fingers to curl into permanent semi-flexed positions. Older smiths often couldn't fully open their hands anymore. The decades of gripping had locked their fingers into tools, holding position even when relaxed. The wrists developed their own constellation of injuries: tendonitis, carpal tunnel syndrome before we had names for such conditions, damage to the small bones from the repeated impact vibrations travelling up from hammer strikes. The hearing damage was perhaps the most underappreciated consequence of the endless repetition. Every hammer strike on the anvil created a sharp, piercing ring, metal on metal at high volume. Hundreds of strikes per hour, thousands per day, tens of thousands per week. The cumulative acoustic trauma was devastating. Most smiths developed severe tinnitus, a constant high-pitched ringing that never stopped, that followed them into whatever sleep they could manage, that made conversation difficult and silence impossible. Many went partially or completely deaf by middle age. What made this darkness truly profound was the psychological toll. The human mind isn't designed for such repetition. We need variety, novelty, cognitive engagement. But the rhythm of smithing allowed for none of that. Once the work began, the smith entered a kind of trance state, his consciousness narrowing to the simple cycle of heat and strike, heat and strike. The same motion repeated until it became automatic, until he was less a thinking being and more a biological machine executing a program. Some smiths, according to saga references, developed what we might recognise as dissociative conditions. They would speak to the iron during work, having one-sided conversations with the metal they were shaping. They would lose themselves in the fire, staring into the forge for extended periods in states that others found disturbing. One saga fragment mentions an older smith called Stein the Silent, who apparently hadn't spoken a word outside his forge in over 10 years. He communicated through gestures and grunts. But when he worked, people claimed they could hear him muttering constantly to his metal, though no one could understand the words. Whether this was mental illness, a coping mechanism, or simply the result of decades of acoustic trauma combined with social isolation is impossible to know. What's clear is that the endless repetition broke something in some smiths, if not their bodies, then their minds. Modern occupational medicine recognises repetitive strain injury as a serious condition, requiring intervention, ergonomic adjustments, rest periods, job rotation. The Viking Age smith had none of these protections. He simply continued the same motions day after day until his body gave out or his mind retreated somewhere the pain couldn't quite reach. The beautiful sword was the product of this mechanical suffering, each hammer strike a small note in a long, grinding song of human degradation. Chapter 7. Winter's Cruel Paradox. If summer smithing was uncomfortable, winter smithing was a special circle of torment. The Viking Age winter in Scandinavia was harsh, temperatures routinely dropping to -20 Celsius or lower, snow measured in feet rather than inches, darkness consuming most of the day. And yet the forge still needed to burn, the work still needed to continue because smiths couldn't afford to simply stop working for 4 or 5 months. They had debts, they had commissions, they had mouths to feed. The fundamental problem was the extreme temperature differential. The forge had to reach the same working temperature regardless of the season, 900 degrees Celsius or more for proper metal working. In summer, this meant the workshop was uncomfortably hot. In winter, it meant existing in a bizarre and hostile microclimate. Stand within 3 feet of the forge and you might be sweating in the intense heat. Step back 5 feet and you're in near freezing temperatures. The workshop walls, often thin wood or wattle and daub, provided minimal insulation. Whatever heat the forge produced either went straight up through the smoke hole or was immediately absorbed by the frigid air flowing through gaps in the walls. The physiological stress of this was enormous. The human body doesn't cope well with rapid temperature changes. Working at the forge, the smith would be overheated, his pores open, his body attempting to cool itself through sweating. Then he'd need to move away, to fetch more fuel, to prepare another piece, to set aside finished work, and the temperature would plummet. His sweat-dampened clothing would turn from cooling to freezing within seconds. The rapid contraction of blood vessels, the shock to his system, the constant cycling between extreme heat and extreme cold was a recipe for illness. What made this truly brutal was the respiratory consequences. The smith was already breathing smoke and metal fumes all day. Add to this the shock of cold air on hot lungs, then hot air on cold lungs, cycling back and forth. The result was predictable. Winter killed more smiths than any other season. Pneumonia, bronchitis, other respiratory infections found easy purchase in lungs, already damaged by years of toxic exposure, and now subjected to constant thermal shock. A cough that started in November might be the smith's death sentence by February. Many smiths who survived decades of summer work died in their first truly harsh winter, after their lung capacity had degraded past some critical threshold. The work itself became more difficult in winter. The metal cooled faster, meaning more frequent returns to the forge, more heating cycles, more fuel consumption. Water, essential for quenching and tempering, would freeze in its containers unless kept near the forge. But keeping water near enough to the forge to stay liquid meant putting it in positions that were awkward to access. Fumbling with hot metal while trying to dip it into water that's positioned oddly, because it had to be near the heat source, created additional accident risks. Burns and injuries increased in winter months. Perhaps most insidious was the fuel problem. Charcoal consumption increased significantly in winter because the forge had to work harder to maintain temperature against the cold air. But winter was also the hardest time to acquire and transport charcoal. Frozen ground, snow-blocked paths, the sheer difficulty of physical labour in extreme cold meant charcoal suppliers could charge premium prices or might not deliver at all if conditions were bad enough. Some smiths found themselves rationing fuel in the middle of winter, trying to complete commissions with insufficient charcoal, making desperate calculations about whether to push through on minimal fire or shut down entirely and face the economic consequences. There's fragmentary evidence of entire smithing families being wiped out by winter illness. One Icelandic genealogy mentions a smith called Thorvald and his 2 sons, all working the same forge, all dead within 3 weeks of each other during the winter of 924. The cold and smoke and thermal shock had weakened them to the point where infection simply rolled through the household like a wave, and there was no medical intervention capable of stopping it. The forge went cold. The family line ended. Their workshop was eventually claimed by another smith who moved into the area, stepping into a dead man's place beside a dead man's anvil. So when you turn your thermostat up on a cold day, when you move from your heated home to your heated car to your heated workplace, with barely a moment of exposure to actual cold, remember the smith standing in his frigid workshop, sweating from forge heat while his feet go numb from cold, knowing that this oscillation is slowly killing him, but unable to stop because winter doesn't pause hunger or debt. Chapter 8. The Secret Knowledge, and the price of keeping it smithing in the Viking Age was not a profession you learned from books or formal schools. The knowledge was transmitted directly from master to apprentice, often within family lines, and it was guarded with a jealousy that bordered on paranoia. The specific techniques for producing quality steel, the precise temperatures for proper tempering, the patterns and methods for creating strong welds in pattern-welded blades. This was proprietary knowledge that represented the smith's competitive advantage and economic survival. To share it freely was to create your own competition, to undermine your own livelihood. This created a culture of secrecy and deception. Master smiths teaching apprentices walked a careful line. They needed to teach enough for the apprentice to become useful labour, but not so much that the apprentice could set up as an independent competitor too easily. The result was that knowledge was often parcelled out incompletely, with critical details withheld until the very end of apprenticeship, or sometimes indefinitely. A master might teach his apprentice 90% of what he knew, but hold back that final 10% that separated competent work from masterful work. What made this darker was that some masters engaged in deliberate misinformation. They would teach apprentices techniques that were subtly wrong, tempering temperatures slightly off, quenching methods that produced inferior results, alloy proportions that were suboptimal. The apprentice, having no other source of information, would internalise these flawed techniques as correct. Years later, when he set up his own workshop, he would produce work that was consistently inferior to his master's, never understanding why. His reputation would suffer, his commissions would dwindle, while the master who taught him continued to prosper with his complete and correct knowledge. There's saga evidence of this practice. One account mentions a smith named Ragnar who trained several apprentices over his career. Those apprentices, upon setting up their own workshops, consistently produced blades that were prone to developing microcracks during the final tempering. This was apparently because Ragnar had taught them a quenching rhythm that was just slightly too fast, cooling the blade unevenly in ways that introduced stress fractures. Whether Ragnar did this deliberately or had himself learned a flawed technique is unclear from the fragmentary text. What's clear is that his apprentices suffered professionally for knowledge they believed was correct but wasn't. The regional variation in smithing techniques suggests the knowledge isolation was profound. A smith in Norway might develop an excellent method for a particular type of weld or edge treatment, but that knowledge would never spread beyond his immediate apprentices and perhaps his sons. A Danish smith 20 miles away might be struggling with the exact problem the Norwegian had solved, but there was no mechanism for sharing that information, no professional journals or conferences or knowledge exchange. Each smith was trapped in his own island of technique, unable to benefit from or contribute to collective advancement. This had economic and social consequences beyond individual smiths. The inconsistency in weapon quality across regions and workshops meant warriors could never be entirely certain what they were purchasing. Two swords that looked identical might perform dramatically differently, because they came from smiths with different levels of true knowledge versus received but flawed knowledge. This created markets for renowned smiths whose reputation suggested reliable quality, but it also meant lesser smiths struggled to compete even if they were potentially skilled, simply because they'd been taught imperfectly. Consider a specific case. A young smith named Einar who completed his apprenticeship and attempted to establish his own workshop. He'd been taught by his uncle, a reasonably successful smith. But Einar's early commissions consistently resulted in blades that, while serviceable, lacked the edge retention of his uncle's work. Customers began to complain. Einar didn't understand why. He was following exactly the techniques he'd been taught. Years later, on his uncle's deathbed, the older man apparently confessed that he'd taught Einar a deliberately inferior carbon distribution method because he feared his nephew would become too successful and draw away his own customers. Einar had wasted 15 years producing suboptimal work because of his uncle's professional paranoia. The modern world's obsession with open-source knowledge, with sharing best practices, with collaborative improvement stands in stark contrast to this. We take for granted that professional knowledge should be disseminated, that workers benefit from learning from each other, that holding back information that could improve someone's work is unethical. The Viking Age smith lived in the opposite world. Knowledge was power, and power was guarded jealously even at the cost of others' livelihoods. The beautiful artifact was produced not through collective expertise, but through isolated pockets of closely held secrets, some true and some deliberately false. Chapter 9. The hierarchy of metal. Not all smiths were equal. Within the smithing trade itself existed a rigid hierarchy that determined status, income and social standing. At the top were the weaponsmiths, those who produced swords, spear points and high-quality axe heads for warriors. Below them were tool makers, smiths who produced agricultural implements, household tools and construction equipment. Below them were those who worked primarily with base metals, producing everyday items from brass, bronze or low-quality iron. And at the bottom were the repair smiths, those who fixed broken tools and weapons but rarely produced new work of their own. This hierarchy was enforced through various means. Weaponsmiths marked their work with personal stamps or patterns, identifying marks that indicated quality and origin. These marks were jealously guarded and legally protected in many regions. To forge another smith's mark, to stamp your inferior weapon with the identifying symbol of a renowned craftsman, was fraud punishable by severe penalties. The mark served as a kind of primitive quality control and branding, allowing customers to theoretically know what they were purchasing. The economic disparity between levels of the hierarchy was substantial. A master weaponsmith producing swords for jarls and wealthy warriors might command prices equal to several ounces of silver per commission. A toolmaker producing ploughshares might earn a fraction of that for similar labour investment. The base metal workers often operated on barter, trading their products for food and necessities rather than receiving actual silver. This created not just economic stratification but genuine class differences within the trade itself. Weaponsmiths might own land and maintain multiple apprentices, while lower-tier smiths lived in perpetual poverty. What made this system particularly cruel was the difficulty of moving up the hierarchy. A smith established his reputation early, and that reputation tended to lock him into his tier. A toolmaker couldn't simply start producing weapons and expect to be taken seriously. He lacked the mark, the reputation, the client network. Even if his technical skills were adequate, the social and economic barriers prevented advancement. Some lower-tier smiths attempted to break through by producing exceptional work and selling it at reduced prices, but this strategy rarely succeeded. The wealthy clients who could afford quality weapons preferred to patronise established weaponsmiths with known reputations, viewing the lower-tier smiths' attempts at quality weapon work with suspicion. Perhaps most disturbing were the cases of fraud and the violent punishments they incurred. Lower-status smiths facing economic desperation sometimes attempted to pass off their work as higher quality by forging marks or making false claims about their products. When caught, the punishments were brutal. There are saga references to smiths who forged marks having their hands mutilated, fingers broken or removed, hands branded with marks of fraud. The logic was both punitive and practical. The mutilated hands mark the smith as a fraud for life, preventing him from continuing his deception, while also serving as public warning. One particular account mentions a toolmaker named Orm, who attempted to sell several of his better weapon productions with a false mark, claiming they came from a renowned weaponsmith 2 valleys over. The deception was discovered when one of the blades failed in use, and the supposed master smith was contacted about the faulty work. When it became clear Orm had forged the mark, he was brought before a local assembly. The judgment was that 2 fingers on his right hand should be struck off at the second knuckle, enough damage to end his career as a fine metal worker, but leaving him capable of rough labour. Orm lived another 20 years, according to the fragmentary records, working as a farm labourer with his crippled hand, the visible price of his attempt to escape his tier of the hierarchy. The psychological weight of this rigid stratification must have been crushing for those at the lower levels. To possess genuine skill in metalworking, to understand the craft deeply, but to be forever relegated to producing horseshoes and door hinges because of where you started, who you trained under, what marks you were entitled to use. This was a systematic denial of potential that we might recognise today as classism within a profession. The modern ideal of meritocracy, where skill can elevate you regardless of origin, was completely absent. Your tier was largely determined by birth and early circumstance, and it rarely changed. Chapter 10. Fire's Terrible Appetite. When workshops burned. The Viking Age smithy was essentially a controlled fire hazard. You had an open forge burning at extreme temperatures, housed in a wooden structure, surrounded by flammable materials, charcoal, dried wood for handles, cloth for polishing, leather for straps and sheaths, often straw on the floor. Add to this sparks flying constantly from hammer strikes on hot metal, the occasional fumbled piece of white-hot iron, and the simple human error that happens during 12-hour workdays when exhaustion sets in. Workshop fires weren't a possibility, they were an inevitability. When a smithy caught fire, the consequences were catastrophic. The structure itself would be consumed rapidly, wooden walls and roof going up in minutes once the fire established itself. The heat from the forge meant the fire had an enormous head start. By the time flames were noticed spreading beyond the forge area, it was often too late to save anything. The smith's tools, his anvil might survive, but his hammers with wooden handles, his tongs, his files and chisels would be damaged or destroyed. His stock of raw materials, metal he'd purchased or accumulated, would be scattered and partially lost in the wreckage. His finished inventory, if he maintained any, would be gone. But the true horror of workshop fires was their tendency to spread. Viking Age settlements were clusters of wooden structures, often built close together for community and practical reasons. A fire in one building rarely stayed contained to that building. The smithy fire would jump to adjacent structures, homes, storage buildings, other workshops. And because Norse buildings often had sod or thatch roofs, which could burn intensely once ignited, and because firefighting capabilities were minimal, buckets of water passed hand to hand essentially. A workshop fire could become a settlement fire, destroying multiple buildings and threatening lives. What made this particularly brutal for the smith was the legal and social responsibility. If your workshop fire spread and destroyed your neighbour's home, you were liable. The principle was simple. You created the hazard, you bear the cost of the damage. This meant a smith whose forge fire escaped control might face demands for compensation that exceeded everything he owned. If the fire killed someone, an occupant trapped in a burning building, a person injured fighting the fire, then a guild might be demanded blood money to compensate the deceased's family. The smith could be utterly ruined, left with debts that would take generations to repay, or he might face outlawry if he couldn't pay. There's a fragmentary account in the Icelandic sagas of a smith named Ketil, whose forge fire spread through his small settlement. The immediate details are sparse, but the outcome is clear. 3 neighbours died in the fire, trapped in their homes as the flames spread faster than they could escape. Ketil survived but faced demands for compensation from the families of the dead, totalling more silver than he could earn in several lifetimes. Unable to pay, unwilling to accept outlawry, Ketil apparently hanged himself in the ruins of his workshop. His widow and children were left destitute, some eventually taken in by relatives, others dispersed to unknown fates. The settlement itself largely disbanded, the survivors moving to other areas, carrying with them the memory of the fire and the smith whose life's work had ended in mass death and suicide. The constant awareness of this danger must have been psychologically exhausting. Every time the smith banked his forge fire at night, he had to trust that the embers wouldn't escape containment. Every time he heated metal to working temperature, he had to be conscious that a single fumbled piece could start an unstoppable disaster. Every time he worked tired, when his judgment was impaired and his reflexes slow, he was risking not just his own livelihood, but his neighbours' homes, and potentially their lives. The responsibility was crushing. Archaeological evidence supports the prevalence of workshop fires. Several smithing sites show clear evidence of catastrophic fire, collapsed structures with burn tools still in place, anvils sitting among charred wood remains, sometimes the outlines of multiple destroyed buildings suggesting spread. One Norwegian site from the 10th century shows the remains of what appears to have been a small smithing complex, workshop plus dwelling, completely destroyed by fire hot enough to partially melt some of the metal stock. The lack of evidence for subsequent rebuilding suggests this was a terminal event, the smith either dead or unable to continue. So when we see historical smithing demonstrations at museums or Renaissance fairs, when we watch a modern blacksmith safely practice traditional techniques in a well-ventilated workshop with fire extinguishers nearby and fire-resistant materials and insurance coverage. Remember, the Viking Age smith worked without any of those protections. He worked knowing that a single mistake, a single moment of inattention, could end not just his career, but his life, his family's security, and potentially the lives of everyone living near him. The beautiful sword in the museum case was forged in a building that was always one spark away from becoming a funeral pyre. Chapter 11. The Client's Curse. Serving Violent Men. The Viking Age, weaponsmiths' primary clientele were warriors, men trained in violence, accustomed to getting their way through intimidation or force, operating in a culture where personal honour and immediate retaliation were paramount values. These were not gentle patrons content to wait patiently for their commissions. They were men who had killed, who expected immediate respect, who viewed themselves as superior to craftsmen. The power dynamic was profoundly unequal, and the smith was always on the losing end. A wealthy jarl commissioning a sword held enormous power over the smith. He could demand specific features, specific timelines, specific quality levels. And if the smith said any of this was unrealistic or impossible, the jarl could simply go elsewhere. Or worse, could interpret the refusal as disrespect. The smith had to negotiate carefully, never outright refusing but attempting to manage expectations, to guide the commission toward what was actually achievable while preserving the client's sense of authority and importance. The payment structure made this even worse. Wealthy clients often paid in installments, some silver up front for materials, the balance upon delivery. But upon delivery could be flexible in practice. A powerful client might take possession of the completed weapon and promise payment soon, knowing the smith had no real recourse. The smith couldn't exactly send armed men to collect from a warrior who was himself armed and dangerous. He couldn't appeal to authorities because often his client was the authority, or was connected to those who held power. The smith simply had to wait, hope, and accept that sometimes he'd never see full payment. What made this truly brutal was the violence that could result from any perceived slight. If a warrior client believed the smith had disrespected him, taken too long, produced inferior work, charged too much, or simply looked at him wrong, retaliation could be immediate and severe. The warrior culture valued immediate response to insult. A smith who angered a warrior client might find himself beaten, his workshop vandalized, his tools stolen or destroyed. In extreme cases, he might simply be killed. There's a saga account of a jarl named Eric who commissioned a sword from a smith called Thrand. The agreed timeline was 3 months. At 2.5 months, Eric arrived at the workshop demanding the sword. Thrand explained it wasn't quite finished. The final edgework and polishing remained. Eric apparently interpreted this as the smith having wasted time, not working diligently enough. According to the saga, Eric struck Thrand across the face with enough force to knock him down, then ordered him to complete the work within 3 days, or face worse. Thrand rushed the final work, delivering a sword that met the basic requirements, but lacked the careful finish he'd planned. Eric accepted it without further payment, claiming the inferior finish justified keeping the final installment of silver he'd promised. The psychological toll of serving such clients was substantial. The smith had to maintain a careful demeanour, respectful but not servile, confident in his craft but not arrogant, willing to negotiate but not weak. It was an exhausting performance that had to be maintained throughout every client interaction. A moment of frustration showing on his face, an unguarded comment about unrealistic demands, a sigh at the wrong moment. Any of these could trigger a violent response from a client who saw himself as deserving absolute deference. Some smiths developed reputations as particularly skilled negotiators with difficult clients, men who could manage warrior egos while still producing quality work on realistic timelines. These smiths were valuable precisely because they'd mastered this secondary skill that had nothing to do with metalworking but everything to do with survival in their profession. Others never mastered it, and their careers were marked by a string of violent encounters, damaged reputation, and economic instability as word spread that they were difficult to work with, meaning they insufficiently submitted to client demands. The modern concepts of contract law, dispute resolution, legal recourse against client misconduct would have seemed fantastical to the Viking Age smith. He operated in a world where might often made right, where his skilled craftsmanship offered no protection against a warrior client's temper, where the beautiful weapon he laboured over for months might be seized without full payment simply because the client had the power to do so. Every commission was a negotiation with potential violence, every client interaction a careful dance around the possibility of sudden brutality. Chapter 12. The Weight of Thor's Hammer. Religious burden and divine comparison. Smithing in Norse culture carried heavy religious and mythological significance that went far beyond simple craft work. The transformation of earth into metal, of raw material into finished weapons, was seen as a kind of creation magic that echoed divine craftsmanship. The smith worked with fire and metal, the same elements the dwarven craftsmen of mythology used to forge the gods' treasures. This association elevated the smith's status in one sense. He was engaged in quasi-magical work, but it also created crushing expectations and spiritual burdens. The mythological precedents were impossibly high. The dwarves had forged Mjolnir, Thor's hammer that never missed its mark and always returned to his hand. They'd created Gungnir, Odin's spear that never failed to strike true. They'd made Draupnir, the golden ring that produced 8 new gold rings every 9th night. These were weapons and objects of absolute perfection, magically enhanced, impossible to replicate. Yet every human smith worked in the shadow of these divine creations. Every sword he made would be compared, at least implicitly, to the legendary weapons of gods and heroes. This created a spiritual dimension to craftsmanship that could be paralysing. If smithing was semi-divine work, then failures weren't just technical problems, they were spiritual failures, suggestions that the smith had lost divine favour or was somehow spiritually inadequate. A weapon that broke in battle might be interpreted not as a flaw in the metal or the technique, but as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their blessing from the smith. In a culture that took religious signs and portents seriously, this could destroy a smith's reputation more completely than any number of technical explanations. What made this particularly dark was the ritual dimension it introduced to the work. Many smiths engaged in elaborate religious observances intended to ensure divine favour and successful crafting. Some made regular offerings at the forge, small amounts of precious metal, food, sometimes animal sacrifices. Some spilled their own blood into the forge fire or quenching water, believing that personal sacrifice would imbue the weapon with power. Archaeological evidence from smithing sites includes votive offerings, suggesting these practices were real and widespread, not just saga embellishment. The psychological weight of believing your craft required divine blessing must have been enormous. It wasn't enough to master the technical aspects. You also had to maintain proper religious observance, avoid spiritual offence, interpret signs and omens correctly. A smith who had a string of failed commissions might genuinely believe he'd angered the gods somehow, that his offerings had been insufficient or improperly conducted. This could lead to increasingly desperate religious observance, more offerings, more sacrifices, more elaborate rituals, consuming time and resources the smith couldn't afford. There's fragmentary evidence of smiths who became obsessed with the religious dimension of their work. One saga mentions a smith who apparently sacrificed a portion of his own blood into every quenching bath, believing this personal offering ensured the weapon's strength. By the time he was in his 50s, he was described as weak and pale, his health apparently damaged by decades of ritualistic blood loss. Another account describes a smith who maintained an elaborate shrine in his workshop. making daily offerings and prayers, spending hours on religious observance that cut into his productive working time. The comparison to Volunda, Wayland, added another layer of darkness. Volunda was the legendary smith who, in the mythology, was captured and hamstrung by a king who wanted to possess his craft. Crippled, unable to escape, Volunda was forced to work for his captor, but he took his revenge through murder and craft, creating weapons and jewellery that brought doom to his captors. The story suggested that smiths possessed dangerous knowledge and potential power, but also that they were vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. It was a mythology that offered no comfort, only the suggestion that suffering and revenge were intrinsic to the smith's existence. So the Viking Age smith worked not just under economic and physical pressure, but under spiritual weight. He wasn't simply trying to make a good sword, he was attempting to echo divine craftsmanship, to channel forces that transcended normal human work, to prove himself worthy of the semi-magical role his culture assigned to him. And when he failed, as humans inevitably do, he faced not just practical consequences, but the suspicion that he'd lost divine favour, that the gods themselves had judged him inadequate. Chapter 13. The Sound of Madness. When hearing dies. Every hammer strike on the anvil created a sharp, piercing sound, metal on metal, ringing out at volumes that could make a bystander wince. For the smith standing directly beside the anvil, this wasn't an occasional disturbance, it was constant acoustic assault. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, the smith's ears were subjected to repeated high-decibel impacts that progressively destroyed his hearing. The damage was cumulative and irreversible, a slow theft of one of his primary senses. The first symptom most smiths noticed was tinnitus, a constant ringing or buzzing in the ears that never stopped. It might start as a faint sound, easy to ignore, during the day but noticeable in the quiet of night. But as the years progressed and the acoustic trauma accumulated, the tinnitus would grow louder, more persistent, more maddening. Eventually it would be present even during work, a high-pitched whine that competed with actual sounds, making it difficult to hear conversation or environmental noises. Following the tinnitus came progressive hearing loss. High-frequency sounds disappeared first. The smith would struggle to hear certain tones, certain voices. As the damage continued, lower frequencies would also fade. By middle age, many smiths had significant hearing impairment. By their 50s, if they lived that long, some were functionally deaf, able to perceive very loud sounds but unable to conduct normal conversation or hear warnings shouted to them. What made this hearing loss particularly cruel was the isolation it created. The smith's work already isolated him to some degree. Long hours in the workshop, focus required for the craft, the smoke and heat making the space uninviting to visitors. But when hearing loss was added, the isolation became profound. Unable to hear normal conversation, the smith would struggle to conduct business negotiations, to interact with family, to participate in community gatherings. He would become increasingly withdrawn, not by choice but by necessity, because communication had become too difficult. The danger this posed was substantial. A deaf smith couldn't hear warnings. If someone shouted, "Fire," he wouldn't hear it until it was too late. If a client entered the workshop and called out a greeting, the smith might not respond, an apparent snub that could damage relationships. If children were playing too close to the hot forge, the smith might not hear their presence until someone was injured. The deaf smith was navigating his workshop and his life with one critical sense impaired, making every day more dangerous. There's saga evidence of the social stigma attached to deafness. References to deaf old gunner who must be shouted at, or stone-eared Bjorn who hears nothing, suggest that hearing loss was not met with accommodation or understanding, but with frustration and mockery. The deaf smith became a figure of some derision, the man who didn't respond when spoken to, who asked people to repeat themselves constantly, who misunderstood conversations and made inappropriate responses based on what he thought he'd heard. Some deaf smiths apparently developed compensatory strategies. They would watch people's mouths, attempting to lip read. They would rely on written communication if they were among the rare literate craftsmen. Some developed gesture systems with regular clients and family members, but these adaptations were incomplete at best. A smith whose primary clients were warriors who prized verbal directness and immediate response was at a severe disadvantage if he couldn't reliably hear what was being said to him. One account describes an elderly smith who was almost completely deaf, who communicated primarily through gestures and by reading facial expressions. His final years, according to the fragment that mentions him, were marked by increasing dependence on his adult son to handle client communications. The son would take commissions, negotiate terms, collect payment, while the deaf father did the actual metal work. When the son died unexpectedly, killed in a farming accident, the deaf smith was left unable to function independently. He survived less than a year, apparently dying of starvation or neglect because he couldn't effectively communicate his needs or manage the business side of his craft. The modern world's accommodations for hearing loss, sign language, hearing aids, written communication norms, legal protections against discrimination, would seem miraculous to the Viking Age smith slowly going deaf. He simply lost one of his critical senses and was expected to continue functioning, continue working, continue surviving with diminished capacity. The beautiful weapon he'd crafted over decades of work, the skill he'd accumulated, meant nothing if he couldn't hear the client explaining what they wanted or warning him of danger in his own workshop. Chapter 14, The Slave Smith's Double Chain. Among the most miserable positions in Viking Age society was that of the thrall smith, a slave who possessed valuable metalworking skills. These were men captured in raids who had been smiths in their home regions, or occasionally the sons of slave smiths born into bondage but trained in the craft. They were valuable property precisely because of their skills, worth more than agricultural slaves or household servants. But they were still property, and their skills made their bondage even more bitter because they knew exactly what their labour was worth, yet they received nothing for it. The slavesmith worked under conditions that would be horrific, even by the already brutal standards of Viking Age smithing. He laboured as long and hard as his owner demanded, which often meant longer hours than a free smith would work. There were no negotiations, no personal need for rest, only the owner's demand for production. He worked in the same toxic forge environment, sustained the same burns and injuries, breathed the same poison. But unlike a free smith, he received no compensation, built no reputation, had no hope of economic advancement. What made this particularly cruel was the physical restraint often imposed on slavesmiths. Despite the obvious danger, many slavesmiths worked in chains or leg shackles. The logic was straightforward. A skilled smith who escaped represented a huge economic loss to his owner. But chains around the ankles or wrists while working near white-hot metal and open fire created horrific accident risks. A free smith could move quickly away from danger. A dropped piece of hot metal, a fire spreading beyond the forge. A chained smith had his mobility restricted, his ability to react compromised. There are references in some sources to slavesmiths being deliberately maimed to prevent escape. Hamstringing, cutting the tendons at the back of the ankle, was one method. It left the slave capable of standing and working at the forge but unable to run. This practice echoed the Völunder legend where the captured smith was hamstrung by his captors. The legendary justification didn't make it any less horrific in practice. A crippled slavesmith, unable to flee, completely dependent on his owner, unable even to properly escape a workshop fire. This was bondage compounded with deliberate mutilation. The mortality rate among slavesmiths appears to have been even higher than among free smiths, which is saying something given how dangerous the profession was generally. They received inadequate food because feeding slaves well was seen as wasteful, just enough to keep them working. They received no medical care for the injuries and illnesses that accumulated. Their living conditions were worse, and they had no recourse, no ability to refuse dangerous work or demand safer conditions. If a slavesmith was worked to death, the owner had lost property, but the slave had lost everything. Perhaps the cruelest aspect was the psychological dimension. A slavesmith possessed genuine skill and knowledge. He understood his craft at a deep level, knew the value of what he created, could see the beautiful weapons and tools emerging from his labour. But none of it belonged to him. He couldn't take pride in his work because he received no credit for it. He couldn't refuse a commission he deemed beneath his skills. He couldn't negotiate for better terms or seek more rewarding work. His expertise, which in a free man would be a source of dignity and economic security, in him was simply another tool his owner exploited. One fragmentary account mentions a slavesmith named Einar who had been captured in a raid on Ireland. He had been a respected smith in his home region, with his own workshop and apprentices. In bondage in Norway, he was forced to work for a jarl who owned 3 farms and several thralls. Einar apparently produced exceptional work, swords of high quality that the jarl sold for substantial profit. Einar himself received minimal food, slept in the thrall quarters, wore chains while he worked. After 15 years of bondage, he apparently died of lung disease, his skills finally consumed by the toxic work environment. The jarl, according to the fragment, considered this regrettable, because finding a replacement smith of equal skill would be difficult and expensive. Einar's life, his craft, his suffering, all reduced to a calculation of property value and replacement cost. The slavesmith's existence was a double imprisonment: the bondage of slavery itself, and the bondage of a craft that destroyed the body regardless of one's legal status. He had no freedom and no future, only endless work until his body or his lungs finally gave out, and when he died without name, without recognition, without anyone remembering that the beautiful sword came from hands that were chained. Chapter 15. The Economics of Desperation. Never enough silver. The financial reality of Viking Age smithing was that most smiths lived in perpetual economic precarity, always one setback away from ruin. The economics of the craft were structurally problematic. High material costs, expensive tools, enormous fuel consumption, inconsistent demand, slow production times, and clients who often paid late or not at all. This combination meant that even successful smiths rarely achieved actual financial security. They simply survived, month to month, commission to commission, hoping the next payment would come before the charcoal supplier demanded settlement. The capital requirements were substantial. An anvil alone represented a major investment, often more silver than a smith might earn in months. Quality iron and steel cost dearly, and the smith typically had to purchase it before being fully paid for the commission it would become. Charcoal consumption was relentless, hundreds of pounds per month for an active workshop. Tools wore out and had to be replaced. The building itself required maintenance. By the time a smith paid for materials, fuel, tool replacement, workshop upkeep and basic living expenses for himself and his family, there was often nothing left. Silver didn't accumulate, it flowed through and disappeared. Credit was the only way most smiths survived, but credit came at a cost. Material suppliers might advance iron or charcoal on credit, but they charged premium prices for the privilege, or demanded the first proceeds from completed commissions, or required other forms of collateral. A smith might find himself working primarily to service debt rather than earn income, completing commissions just to pay what he owed to suppliers, never getting ahead, never building any buffer against disaster. What made this particularly brutal was the effect on the work itself. A smith desperate for income might accept more commissions than he could reasonably complete at high quality. He might cut corners, using cheaper materials, reducing work time, skipping steps in the process to speed production and get paid faster. But this strategy almost always backfired. The inferior work would damage his reputation, leading to fewer future commissions or clients demanding reduced prices. The short-term gain created long-term damage. But when you're facing immediate debt payments, long-term considerations feel irrelevant. Some smiths fell into debt bondage, a condition that approached slavery in everything but name. Unable to pay his debts, a smith might be legally bound to work for his creditor until the debt was satisfied. But the terms of such arrangements were entirely in the creditor's favour. The creditor determined how much of the smith's work went toward a debt reduction versus covering ongoing costs. A smith in debt bondage might work years without ever actually reducing his debt, trapped in a system designed to extract his labour indefinitely. There's evidence of smiths losing their workshops entirely to creditors. One account mentions a smith named Thorgrim, who, after several years of poor commissions and expensive materials, owed more silver to his various creditors than he could ever hope to repay. The largest creditor, the man who supplied his iron, apparently seized Thorgrim's tools and workshop space as settlement of debt. Thorgrim, his means of production gone, had no way to earn income to support his family. The saga fragment notes only that Thorgrim and his wife went north seeking work, which likely means they became landless labourers, their smithing career simply over because debt had consumed everything. The psychological toll of perpetual economic insecurity was severe. A smith could never relax, never feel secure, never stop worrying about how he'd meet the next payment. Every commission carried enormous pressure because failure might mean he couldn't pay for the fuel to continue working. Every client who was slow to pay created cascading problems with suppliers who wanted their own payment. The constant anxiety, the calculations of what he could afford and what he couldn't, the terror of a major setback like illness or injury that would stop production. These ground away at mental health and overall well-being. So when we see a beautiful Viking weapon and think about the craft and skill involved, we should also think about the economic desperation that often surrounded its creation. The smith who made it was likely working in debt, using credit he'd struggled to repay, knowing that this commission had to succeed because failure meant potential ruin. The beauty of the object emerged not from financial security and creative freedom, but from desperate necessity and the constant fear of economic collapse. Chapter 16. The Raw Hand. Permanent deformity as a badge. Look at your own hands for a moment. Notice the flexibility of your fingers, the smoothness of your skin, the way your hand opens and closes without thought or pain. Now imagine those hands transformed by decades of brutal labour into something barely recognisable as human appendages. That was the inevitable fate of the Viking Age smith's hands. They became tools themselves, reshaped by their work into deformed, scarred, barely functional versions of what hands should be. The scars accumulated from the first day of apprenticeship onward. Small burns that left white marks, larger burns that created patches of thickened, discoloured tissue. Cuts from sharp metal edges, some shallow, some deep enough to damage tendons. The scars layered over each other, year after year, until the smith's hands looked like maps of accumulated trauma. Old smiths' hands were often more scar tissue than original skin. The burns so numerous they merged into a continuous landscape of damage. But the visible scars were only part of the story. The repetitive gripping of hammer and tongs caused the tendons in the hands to thicken and shorten. Over years, this meant the fingers could no longer fully extend. They remained in a partial curve even when the smith tried to open his hand completely. The condition worsened with age until elderly smiths had hands that were locked into permanent tool-gripping positions. Their fingers couldn't straighten anymore. The tendons had been reshaped by decades of the same motion, contracted into their working position permanently. The constant vibration from hammering caused nerve damage. Every strike of hammer on metal sent vibration up through the handle, into the hand, into the wrist, into the arm. Thousands of strikes per day meant thousands of tiny traumas to the nerves. The result was progressive numbness and tingling. The smith would lose fine sensation in his fingertips, would struggle to feel subtle differences in texture or temperature. For a craft that required precise judgment of when metal had reached exactly the right temperature for working, this loss of sensation was professionally devastating. What made this particularly cruel was that the hand damage eventually ended careers. A smith whose fingers couldn't grip properly anymore, whose hands were so damaged they couldn't hold tools with sufficient control, simply couldn't continue working at a high level. He might be able to do rough work, basic repairs, simple tasks, but the fine detail work required for quality weapons was beyond him. His career ended not with retirement or choice, but with his hands simply becoming too damaged to function. And since hands damaged this severely were often not useful for other forms of manual labour either, the elderly smith with ruined hands faced grim prospects. Archaeological evidence confirms this occupational damage. Skeletal remains identified as smiths through workshop association or tool burial show, characteristic bone changes in the hands and wrists. The finger bones show signs of repeated stress fractures that healed poorly. The wrist bones show arthritis patterns consistent with repetitive motion and vibration damage. One particularly well-preserved skeleton from Norway, found with smithing tools, showed such severe deformation in both hands that modern forensic analysis concluded the individual would have been in constant pain and had severely limited hand function in his final years. Consider the psychological impact of watching your own hands transform. As a young apprentice, your hands might be soft, unmarked, fully functional. By 30, they're scarred but still capable. By 40, they're noticeably deformed, the scars thick, the movement restricted. By 50, if you live that long, they're barely recognisable, twisted, locked in position, covered in scar tissue, causing constant pain. You've watched your primary tools, your own hands, deteriorate incrementally, knowing that when they finally give out completely, your livelihood ends with them. Some smiths apparently try to hide the extent of their hand damage from potential clients, knowing that visible deformity might suggest declining skill. They would keep their hands moving during negotiations, or keep them partially hidden, or downplay their difficulties. But the deception could only go so far. Eventually the tremor in the grip, the fumbling with tools, the inability to perform fine detail work would reveal the truth. The smith's hands were giving out, and his career was ending whether he was ready or not. So the next time you think about the skilled hands of a craftsman, remember, those hands paid an enormous price for that skill. They were scarred, deformed, damaged, and ultimately destroyed by the very work they performed. The Viking Age smith's hands were both his greatest asset and the record of his suffering, bearing permanent witness to decades of accumulated trauma that we barely remember when we admire the artifacts those ruined hands created. Chapter 17. The Charcoal Gatherer's Burden. Fuel's Hidden Cost. Every hour of smithing work required enormous amounts of fuel. A forge hot enough to work iron consumed charcoal at an astonishing rate. An active workshop might burn through several £100 of charcoal per week. Over a year, a single smith might require several tons of charcoal just to keep his forge operational. This created a massive logistical challenge and a hidden environmental cost that we rarely consider when admiring Viking Age metalwork. Charcoal wasn't something you simply purchased in convenient bags. It had to be produced through a labour-intensive process. Wood had to be cut, stacked in carefully arranged mounds, covered with earth and turf, then burned slowly in an oxygen-limited environment that converted the wood to charcoal rather than simply burning it to ash. The process took days, required constant monitoring, and was dangerous. Charcoal mounds could collapse, explode, or burn out of control. A single charcoal production cycle might yield several £100s of charcoal from several cords of wood. For the smith, this created several problems. He could attempt to produce his own charcoal, which meant taking time away from smithing work to cut wood, process it, manage the burn, and transport the finished charcoal. This was enormously time-consuming labour that didn't directly earn income. Alternatively, he could purchase charcoal from specialised charcoal makers, but this meant being dependent on suppliers who could charge premium prices and who might not deliver reliably, especially in winter or other difficult seasons. The economics of charcoal were brutal. A smith needed constant supply. Running out of fuel meant work stopped immediately. But stockpiling large quantities required storage space and represented capital tied up in inventory. If the smith bought too much charcoal at once, he might not have silver for other necessities. If he bought too little, he risked running out mid-commission. The balancing act was constant and precarious, and charcoal suppliers knew they held leverage. A smith desperate for fuel had little negotiating power. What made this darker was the environmental destruction charcoal production caused. Each batch of charcoal required several cords of wood, multiple trees. An active smithing community might consume hundreds of trees per year just for charcoal. Over decades, this meant extensive deforestation of the surrounding landscape. Archaeological evidence shows that some long-term smithing centres in Scandinavia were eventually abandoned partly because local wood sources had been exhausted, forcing smiths to either relocate or find fuel sources from increasingly distant areas. The human cost in the charcoal making trade was substantial. Charcoal makers were typically among the poorest workers, living in forest camps near their work, exposed to the smoke and fumes from the charcoal mounds constantly. The work damaged their lungs even more severely than smithing damaged smiths' lungs, because they were exposed to wood smoke for days at a time during burns. Many charcoal makers died young from respiratory disease, living in poverty at the bottom of an economic chain that extracted their health for minimal compensation. There's some evidence that charcoal making was often assigned to thralls or the poorest free workers who had no other options. One saga reference mentions the charcoal slaves working in the forests, suggesting this was considered among the worst forms of labour. The irony was profound. At the top of the chain was the beautiful sword admired by warriors and jarls. At the bottom was a slave or desperately poor man slowly dying of smoke inhalation in a forest camp, cutting trees to feed a fire that would make charcoal to feed another fire that would make the metal that would make the weapon. The suffering was layered and hidden, invisible in the final product. Some smithing operations apparently collapsed when fuel sources became too distant or expensive. If local forests were exhausted and charcoal had to be transported from 20 or 30 miles away, the cost became prohibitive. A smith might find himself unable to afford the fuel to continue working, his career ending not from lack of skill, but from simple resource depletion. The workshop that had operated for decades would go cold. The smith would have to find other work or relocate, and the community would lose its metalworking capacity. One account describes a smithing cluster in what's now Sweden that apparently operated continuously for over a century before being abandoned in the late 10th century. Modern archaeological survey of the area shows extensive evidence of historical deforestation, stumps and root systems suggesting dense forests that were systematically cleared. Pollen analysis shows the forest composition changed dramatically during the smithing operation's active period, then slowly recovered after abandonment. The metal artifacts produced there are scattered across museums now, beautiful objects that represent not just human labour, but ecological destruction on a scale that made the entire operation unsustainable. So when you see a Viking Age sword, remember, it's not just metal and skill. It's also hundreds of pounds of charcoal, dozens of trees, possibly the labour of slaves or impoverished workers dying from smoke exposure in forest camps. The environmental and human cost extended far beyond the smith's workshop, creating chains of suffering and resource extraction that we've completely forgotten in our admiration of the craftsmanship. Chapter 18. The Journey's Danger, Travelling for Materials. The ideal smithing situation was to have everything you needed within easy reach. Good iron sources, reliable charcoal suppliers, and clients all in the same general area. But reality was rarely ideal. Sometimes a smith needed to travel for specific materials, or to fulfill distant commissions, or to acquire specialised knowledge or tools. And travel in the Viking Age was dangerous in ways modern people can barely comprehend. The distances involved were substantial. Quality iron ore or bog iron might be several days' travel from the smith's workshop. A wealthy client commissioning special work might be in a different valley, requiring a journey through difficult terrain. Travel in Scandinavia meant navigating forests, crossing rivers, traversing mountain passes, following paths that were often poorly maintained or completely unmarked. There were no roads in the modern sense, no way stations, no emergency services if something went wrong. The physical dangers were numerous. Wild animals, wolves, bears, posed real threats, especially to a solitary traveller. Weather could turn suddenly, and getting caught in a storm while travelling could be fatal. Rivers could flood, making crossing impossible or sweeping away anyone who attempted it. Simply getting lost was a serious risk. Take a wrong turn in dense forest, and you might wander for days without finding your way back to civilization. But perhaps the most significant danger was from other humans. A smith travelling alone with valuable materials or finished goods was an attractive target for bandits. Metal, especially finished weapons, could be sold or used. A smith carrying several completed swords or a quantity of quality iron was essentially carrying his entire workshop's wealth in easily portable form. And smiths weren't warriors. They lacked the combat training and often the physical conditioning to defend themselves effectively. They were skilled in metalworking, not in violence. What made this particularly brutal was that a smith often had no choice but to travel. If a wealthy jarl commissioned a weapon and specified he wanted it delivered personally, the smith travelled. If quality iron could only be obtained from a source 3 days away, the smith travelled. If an apprenticeship opportunity or a chance to learn new techniques required going to another region, the smith travelled. The risks were understood, but the economic necessity overrode the danger. There are saga references to smiths who simply disappeared during travel. One mentions a smith named Herjolf, who set out to deliver 2 completed swords to a client and was never seen again. The assumption, according to the text, was that he was ambushed and killed for the swords he carried. His body was never found. His family received no compensation. His workshop was eventually taken over by another smith. He simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the dangers of travel with valuable goods in a time when one's life depended on one's ability to defend it. The psychological burden of these journeys must have been substantial. Imagine setting out on a 3-day journey through forest and over mountain passes, carrying weapons worth months of your income, knowing you're unarmed and untrained in combat, knowing that bandits operate in these areas, knowing that no one will help you if you're attacked. The entire journey would be spent in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every sound, seeing potential threats everywhere. And this wasn't occasional. Some smiths had to make such journeys multiple times per year. Some smiths apparently tried to band together for travel, creating small groups that offered some protection through numbers. Others hired guards, though this ate into already thin profit margins. Still others attempted to travel in secret, revealing their route and timing to no one, hoping anonymity would be protection. But every strategy had weaknesses, and the fundamental vulnerability remained. A smith away from his workshop was out of his element, exposed, and potentially doomed if he encountered anyone willing to use violence for profit. One particularly dark account describes a smith who was found dead beside the road, his tools scattered around him, clear signs of a struggle. What made the account notable was that his tools had been taken but then apparently discarded nearby. The killers realised the specialised smithing tools were worthless to anyone who wasn't a smith. They'd killed him, searched his belongings, found nothing easily valuable, and left both his body and his tools by the roadside. The smith had died for nothing, and his life's tools, his means of livelihood, lay scattered in the dirt until someone from his village came looking for him days later. So the beautiful sword carried by a warrior might have required its maker to risk his life simply delivering it. The journey might have taken the smith through dangerous territory, exposed to weather and wild animals and human predators, with no protection but luck. Some smiths survived these journeys and returned home safely. Others didn't, their stories ending on some forgotten forest path, their names eventually lost, remembered only as another craftsman who went out one day and never came back. Chapter 19. The Failed Commission. When everything goes wrong. Despite all precautions, all skill, all careful work, sometimes a commission simply failed. The metal might have a hidden flaw that didn't reveal itself until the final stages. The tempering might go wrong despite perfect technique. An accident might destroy hours or weeks of work, or the client's specifications might prove to be physically impossible, but the smith only discovered this after committing time and materials. When a major commission failed, the consequences for the smith could be absolutely devastating. The immediate economic impact was severe. All the materials consumed, the iron, the charcoal, the other components, represented money the smith had spent or debt he'd taken on. If the commission failed before completion, those materials were largely wasted. Some might be salvageable for other purposes, but a half-finished sword blade that cracked during tempering was largely useless. The metal was now stressed and unreliable, unsuitable for critical applications. The smith had converted valuable raw materials into worthless scrap. The labour investment was equally lost. If a smith had spent 100 hours working on a piece that ultimately failed, those were 100 hours he could have spent on successful commissions. The opportunity cost was enormous. While he'd been working on the failed piece, he'd turned down or been unable to take on other work. His workshop had produced nothing saleable. His income had stopped, but his expenses had continued. The debt to suppliers was still owed. The family still needed food, the workshop still needed maintenance. But the economic damage extended beyond the immediate loss. The client who commissioned the work had expectations. When those expectations weren't met, the smith's reputation suffered. Word spread in small Norse communities. A smith who failed a commission would find that story circulating among potential clients. Future commissions might be harder to secure. Clients might demand lower prices, citing the previous failure. The smith's ability to earn income going forward was impaired, sometimes permanently. What made this truly brutal was that the smith often owed compensation for the failure, even though he had already lost his material and labour investment. If a client had paid a deposit, common for major commissions, he would expect either the finished work or his deposit returned. The smith, having consumed the materials and his time, might have no way to return the deposit. The client might demand additional compensation for breach of agreement. The smith could end up owing more than he had received, turned by the failed commission into a debtor rather than a craftsman. In some cases, smiths who couldn't fulfill obligations or provide compensation simply fled. One saga account mentions a smith named Olaf, who accepted a major commission, 3 matching swords for a wealthy client's sons, and received substantial advance payment. The first 2 swords were completed successfully. The third, during final tempering, developed a stress crack that ran half the length of the blade, making it unusable. Olaf couldn't make the third sword, couldn't return the payment he'd already spent, and faced demands for compensation he didn't have. According to the saga, he simply disappeared one night, abandoning his workshop, his family, his community. He became effectively an outlaw, starting over somewhere else with nothing, his career and reputation destroyed by one failed commission he couldn't remedy. More devastating still were smiths who, facing the consequences of failed commissions they couldn't make right, chose to end their lives rather than face the shame and economic ruin. The honour culture of Viking Age Scandinavia made failure deeply shameful, especially when it involved breaching obligations to clients of higher social status. A smith who felt he dishonoured himself through failure, who saw no path to recovery, might view suicide as preferable to living with destroyed reputation and crushing debt. One fragmentary text mentions a smith of considerable reputation who accepted a commission from a jarl for a sword of specific characteristics: length, weight, decorative elements. The smith worked for months, producing what he believed was exceptional work, but the final blade, in testing, proved to have edge retention problems. The carefully crafted edge dulled more quickly than it should have. The jarl rejected the sword as below standard, demanded his substantial payment returned, and publicly criticised the smith's work. The smith, unable to repay the silver and facing destroyed reputation among his primary client base, apparently hanged himself in his workshop. His son found him hanging from a roof beam above the cold forge, the rejected sword lying on the ground below. The son was too young to take over the workshop. The smith's family was left with nothing but debt and shame. The psychological weight of knowing that any commission could fail catastrophically, that years of successful work could be undone by one piece that went wrong, must have been crushing. Every time a smith brought a piece to the critical final stages, the tempering, the final hardening, the testing, he must have felt profound anxiety. This was the moment where everything could fall apart, where all the invested time and material and labour could become worthless. And if it did, if this was the commission that failed, he might lose everything. His workshop, his livelihood, his reputation, possibly his life if the consequences were severe enough. Chapter 20. The competition's edge. Sabotage and treachery. In an ideal world, craftsmen would support each other, share knowledge, celebrate collective success. But the Viking Age smithing trade operated in conditions of scarcity, limited clients, limited resources, limited opportunities. This created fierce competition that sometimes turned ugly. Smiths in the same region weren't colleagues. They were rivals fighting for the same pool of potential clients, and some were willing to cross ethical lines to gain advantage or harm competitors. The most straightforward form of competitive harm was economic undercutting. A smith might offer to complete commissions at prices below his actual costs, accepting short-term losses to steal clients from competitors and potentially drive those competitors out of business. Once the competition was eliminated, prices could return to sustainable levels. This strategy was risky. The undercutting smith might bankrupt himself before his competitor failed, but it was attempted. The result was price wars that benefited clients in the short term, but destabilised the entire local smithing trade. But economic competition sometimes escalated into direct sabotage. A smith might pay someone to spread rumours about a competitor's work, claims that his weapons were prone to failure, that he used inferior materials, that he was unreliable. In small communities where reputation was everything, such rumours could be devastating, even if completely false. By the time the targeted smith learned of the rumours and attempted to counter them, damage was done. Clients who heard the rumours might choose someone else, and proving the claims false was nearly impossible. What made this particularly dark was evidence of physical sabotage. Smiths depended on their suppliers for materials: iron, charcoal, specialised items. A rival might convince a supplier to sell contaminated materials to a competitor. Iron mixed with substandard ore, charcoal that had been improperly produced and wouldn't burn hot enough. The competitor, unknowingly using these materials, would produce inferior work, damaging his reputation while never understanding why his techniques had suddenly stopped yielding good results. By the time he realised the materials were the problem, he might have already completed several failed commissions. More direct sabotage involved damaging competitors' workshops or tools. A smith's tools were valuable and took years to accumulate and perfect. breaking into a competitor's workshop and damaging key tools, filing notches into the anvil face, breaking hammer handles, ruining files and chisels, could set the competitor back significantly. The destroyed tools had to be replaced at considerable cost. The time needed to acquire or make replacements meant lost productivity. If the targeted smith couldn't determine who was responsible, he had no recourse for compensation. He simply had to absorb the loss. The most extreme form of competitive sabotage was arson. A smith's workshop was vulnerable to fire by its very nature. Flammable materials, open flames, wooden construction. A deliberate fire set at night when the workshop was empty could destroy the entire operation. Building, tools, materials, everything. If done carefully, arson was difficult to prove. A workshop burning down might be seen as simply the unfortunately common accident that all smiths feared. The targeted smith was ruined, his means of livelihood destroyed, while the saboteur faced no consequences unless caught in the act. There's saga evidence of long-running feuds between smithing families that included allegations of sabotage and violence. One account describes two smithing operations in adjacent valleys that apparently engaged in decades of conflict. The text mentions fires, damaged tools, apprentices attacked while travelling, materials stolen. Both families accused the other of initiating the conflict. By the time the saga was written, several people had died in incidents connected to the feud, whether through accidents, retaliatory violence, or workshop disasters is unclear. The feud only ended when one family's smithing line died out, the last smith killed in what the saga describes as an ambush, though the details are fragmentary. The inability to appeal to higher authority for justice made these situations particularly intractable. In most Norse communities, there was no strong centralised authority to investigate and punish industrial sabotage. The smith who suffered from a competitor's actions had to either absorb the loss or seek his own revenge. This created cycles of retaliation that could persist for years or generations. Each act of sabotage demanded response. Each response invited counter-response. The feud became its own entity, consuming the energy and resources that should have gone into productive work. The psychological toll of operating in this environment must have been substantial. A smith couldn't trust his suppliers completely. They might be working with competitors. He couldn't trust his security. His workshop might be vandalised or burned. He had to guard his techniques jealously, while worrying that others were undermining him through sabotage he might not detect until it was too late. Every setback raised the question, was this natural misfortune or deliberate sabotage by a rival? The paranoia and stress added to all the other burdens of the profession. So the beautiful Viking Age sword represents not just skill and labour, but also existed in an ecosystem of cutthroat competition, where smiths sometimes harmed each other to gain advantage. The cooperation and knowledge sharing we associate with professional communities was largely absent, replaced by suspicion, sabotage, and occasionally violence. The craft suffered from this competition. Progress was hindered, and individual smiths lived in constant awareness that their rivals might be actively working to destroy them. Chapter 21. The Master's Decline. Growing old in fire. There was no retirement for a Viking Age smith, no pension plan, no comfortable final years where he could rest on past accomplishments. A smith worked until his body gave out completely, or until he died, whichever came first, and the accumulation of decades of occupational damage meant that old, for a smith, often came disturbingly young, men in their 50s with bodies that looked and functioned like they belonged to men 20 years older. The physical decline came in layers, each system failing at its own pace. The eyes went first for many, the vision damage from staring at hot metal for decades finally reaching the point where the smith simply couldn't see well enough to judge temperatures or perform detail work. Some adapted by working more by feel and sound, relying on decades of experience to compensate for lost vision. But there were limits to this adaptation. A half-blind smith was dangerous to himself and others in a workshop full of hot metal and open flame. The lungs typically followed. The decades of breathing smoke and metal fumes left them scarred and rigid, unable to draw sufficient breath. The simple act of breathing became laboured. The smith would find himself stopping frequently to catch his breath, his chest heaving from exertion that years ago wouldn't have winded him. The characteristic smith's cough, present for years, became constant and productive, bringing up discoloured phlegm that suggested the ongoing damage to lung tissue. Respiratory infections that a younger man might shake off could become fatal in lungs already operating at minimum capacity. The hands and arms lost their strength and coordination. The arthritis that had been manageable became crippling. Gripping the hammer caused such pain that the smith would wince with every strike. The accuracy suffered. Swings that should land precisely on target would miss by inches because damaged shoulders and elbows couldn't execute the movement properly anymore. The reduced strength meant the smith needed more strikes to accomplish the same work, extending the time required and increasing the fatigue. What made this decline particularly cruel was that the smith's knowledge and experience were at their peak precisely when his body was failing. An elderly smith understood his craft with a depth that only decades could provide. He knew every subtlety of temperature and timing, could diagnose problems by sound or appearance, could envision the finished piece from the raw materials. His mind held everything he had learned, but his body could no longer execute what his mind knew. The frustration of understanding exactly what needed to be done while being physically incapable of doing it must have been agonizing. The economic implications were dire. As the smith's productivity declined and his quality became inconsistent due to failing abilities, his income dropped. But his expenses didn't. He still needed food, shelter, fuel. Clients might stop bringing commissions to a smith whose hands shook and whose eyes couldn't focus. The smith who had spent 40 years building a reputation might see that reputation evaporate in the final years, as his declining abilities became obvious to everyone. Some elderly smiths became dependent on adult children, particularly sons who had learned the trade. The son would do the actual physical work while the father provided guidance and consultation. This arrangement could work if family relationships were good and if the son was willing to support his aging father. But it also created potential resentment. The son doing the labour while the father retained authority, or the father feeling useless and burdensome as he watched his son work the forge he could no longer operate. For smiths without family support, the decline into poverty was often rapid. A smith too old to work but with no one to care for him might become dependent on community charity. Minimal provisions from neighbours who remembered his past contributions but had their own struggles. Some ended up in truly desperate circumstances, former master craftsmen living in near destitution, their skills and decades of work meaning nothing once their bodies failed. There was no social safety net, no system to ensure that a lifetime of valuable labour led to any security in old age. There are fragmentary accounts of elderly smiths dying alone in their workshops, sometimes days before anyone discovered them. One saga mentioned describes a smith named Thorkel, who was found dead at his anvil, apparently having collapsed while working. He was estimated to be in his 60s, remarkably old for a smith. The text notes that he'd been working despite severe breathing difficulties and nearly blind, driven by debt and the lack of any alternative means of survival. His body was found with his tools, his forge cold, his final work, a half-finished axe head, still on the anvil where it had cooled into an unusable state. The fear of becoming old and incapacitated while still needing to work must have haunted every smith. They could see their future in elderly smiths around them, the shaking hands, the laboured breathing, the desperation in men who knew their abilities were gone, but who had no choice but to continue. Every birthday was a step closer to that fate. Every time a task became harder or took longer, it was a reminder that the decline was inevitable and that there would be no comfortable ending, only continued struggle until death finally ended it. So when we think about master craftsmen, we tend to imagine wisdom and respect, a comfortable elder stateship where accumulated knowledge is valued. For the Viking Age smith, old age meant physical failure, economic precarity, and often desperate poverty. The mastery they'd achieved meant nothing if their bodies couldn't execute it, and the decades of valuable labour earned them no guarantee of dignity or security in their final years. Chapter 22. The Woman's Invisible Hand. Female Smiths and Widows. The Viking Age smithing trade was overwhelmingly male-dominated, but archaeological evidence suggests that women were not entirely absent from metalworking. A few burials have been found with both, female remains and smithing tools suggesting some women worked as smiths. More commonly, smiths' widows inherited workshops and attempted to continue operations. But women who worked metal faced obstacles that went far beyond the already brutal challenges of the craft itself. They confronted systematic prejudice, sexual harassment, accusations of impropriety or witchcraft, and legal barriers to operating independently. The cultural assumption was that metalworking was inherently masculine work. It required physical strength, it dealt with fire and transformation, it was associated with warfare and violence. A woman attempting to work as a smith violated these gender expectations fundamentally. She was engaging in men's work, crossing boundaries that Norse society preferred to keep rigid. This made her suspect, transgressive, someone who needed explanation or justification for her presence in the craft. For the rare women who learned smithing skills, typically daughters of smiths who had no sons, or women who for whatever reason acquired the knowledge, the prejudice from clients could be overwhelming. Warriors accustomed to dealing with male smiths might refuse to commission work from a woman, believing female-made weapons would be inferior or cursed. The woman smith might produce work of identical or superior quality to male competitors, but cultural prejudice meant she struggled to find clients willing to give her the opportunity to prove herself. What made this particularly dark was the sexual dimension that entered into women's professional interactions. A male client might view a female smith as sexually available, her professional independence interpreted as sexual availability. The woman had to navigate not just the business negotiation, but also unwanted sexual advances, sometimes from clients whose commissions she needed for economic survival. Refusing such advances might cost her the commission and damage her reputation. She could be labelled difficult or proud for asserting basic boundaries. The accusation of witchcraft was an ever-present danger for successful female smiths. The transformation of metal was already seen as semi-magical when men did it. When a woman achieved the same transformation, it was more likely to be interpreted as actual witchcraft rather than skill. If a weapon she made performed well, it might be attributed to magic rather than craftsmanship. If it failed, she could be accused of deliberate cursing. Either way, her success became dangerous rather than professionally rewarding. There's fragmentary evidence of this phenomenon. One account mentions a woman named Aud, who apparently operated a metalworking operation in Iceland in the mid-10th century. The saga fragment notes that she was skilled beyond what women should be in metalwork, and that rumours circulated about how she achieved such skill, implication being that supernatural means were suspected. After producing a sword that reportedly performed exceptionally well, she was apparently accused of using Seder, magic, to enhance it. The outcome of the accusation isn't clear from the surviving text, but the fact that she was mentioned at all suggests her story was unusual enough to be noteworthy and problematic. More common than female smiths were smiths' widows who inherited workshops and attempted to continue the operation. When a smith died, his tools, his workspace, his materials and his reputation became part of his estate. If he had an adult son, the son typically took over, but if he had only a widow and perhaps young children, the widow might attempt to keep the business operational, hiring journeyman smiths to do the actual forge work while she managed the business side, or in some cases attempting to do the work herself if she had learned the craft through proximity. These widows faced immense pressure from multiple directions. Male relatives might attempt to seize the workshop, claiming women couldn't properly manage it. Clients might take their business elsewhere, uncomfortable dealing with a woman. Suppliers might charge higher prices or refuse credit, viewing the widow as a poor risk. Adult sons, if present, might push their mother aside to claim the workshop themselves, seeing her as merely a placeholder rather than a legitimate operator. The widow's attempts to maintain her livelihood could be undermined at every turn by a society that didn't believe women should operate independently in male-dominated trades. One account describes a widow named Sigrid, whose husband had run a successful tool-making operation. After his death, she attempted to continue the business with the help of a hired journeyman smith who did the forge work. For 3 years, she apparently managed successfully, maintaining her husband's clients and even expanding the business. But her adult sons from a previous marriage, who had their own farms and had shown no interest in smithing, apparently conspired to have her declared incompetent to manage the workshop. They claimed before a local assembly that a woman couldn't properly supervise metalworking, and that the workshop should be seized and given to them to manage. The assembly apparently agreed. Sigrid was forced out of the workshop she'd successfully operated for 3 years, and her sons took control, reportedly running it into the ground within 2 years through neglect and poor management. The psychological burden of operating in this environment must have been crushing. A woman smith or workshop manager wasn't just fighting the normal battles of the craft: economic pressure, material costs, demanding clients. She was also constantly defending her right to exist in the space at all, proving her competence over and over to people who were predisposed to doubt her, navigating sexual harassment and accusations of witchcraft that male smiths never faced. Her successes were attributed to magic or luck, her failures used as evidence that women shouldn't be doing this work. So when we think about historical crafts, we should remember, women who attempted these trades faced double difficulties. The Viking Age woman who worked metal dealt with all the brutal occupational hazards that destroyed men's bodies, plus systematic prejudice, sexual harassment, and social condemnation for crossing gender boundaries. Some succeeded anyway, their names mostly forgotten, their accomplishments erased or minimised. The beautiful artefact might have been made by female hands, but the historical record has largely written them out of the story. Chapter 23: The Weapon's Curse. When your creation kills. Every sword the smith made was designed for one purpose: to kill. Every axe head, every spear point, every knife blade. These were not artistic expressions or abstract creations. They were tools of death, and everyone involved understood this explicitly. The smith spent his days creating objects that would be used to end human lives, and the psychological weight of this reality must have been profound for at least some practitioners of the craft. Consider what it means to forge a sword. You're taking raw metal and transforming it, through heat and force, into an implement optimized for piercing human flesh, for severing limbs, for causing the kind of damage to the human body that results in death. You're shaping the blade's profile to maximize cutting efficiency. You're hardening the edge to maintain sharpness through repeated impacts with bone and armor. You're balancing the weight so a warrior can swing it effectively at another human being's neck or torso. Every technical decision you make is ultimately in service of the weapon's killing function. The smith couldn't maintain comfortable distance from this reality. Warriors who commissioned weapons were often quite explicit about their intended use. I'm raiding an island next spring, or I have a feud to settle, or simply, I need something that will kill reliably. The smith was being asked to enable violence, to make it more effective, to provide the tools that would allow one human to destroy another. He wasn't making agricultural tools that happened to be repurposed for violence. He was making dedicated killing implements. What made this psychologically darker was that the smith would sometimes learn the specific outcomes of his work. A warrior would return from a raid or a battle and describe how the sword performed, how many men it killed, how it felt cutting through flesh, whether the balance was good for repeated strikes. The smith would hear about his creation's body count, or he'd learn that a weapon he made killed someone he knew, someone from a neighbouring valley or a rival clan. The abstract killing implement would become concrete. This specific person died because of something you made. Some saga accounts suggest smiths were haunted by their creations. There are references to smiths who dreamed of the weapons they'd made, who saw visions of the deaths those weapons caused, who developed what we might recognise as guilt or moral injury from their role in violence. One fragmentary text describes a smith who apparently stopped making weapons entirely in his later years, refusing all commissions for swords or spears, producing only agricultural tools. The text suggests he'd become troubled by the deaths connected to his earlier work, though the details are unclear. The moral weight seems to have been particularly heavy when the smith knew the victim. In a small society where everyone was connected through kinship or community networks, it was entirely possible that a weapon you made would kill someone you'd met, traded with, or were distantly related to. The sword commissioned by a warrior might end up in a feud that killed your neighbour's son. The axe you sold might be used in a dispute that took the life of someone's brother. The violence wasn't abstract. It was personal and close. There's one particularly haunting account of a smith named Grim who made a sword for a young warrior named Knut. The sword was reportedly beautiful and well balanced. 3 years later, Knut killed Grim's own nephew in a property dispute, using that same sword. Grim had literally made the weapon that killed his sister's son. According to the saga fragment, Grim tried to demand weregild from Knut, but Knut argued that since Grim had made the weapon, he bore partial responsibility for the death, a twisted logic that apparently gained some support in the local assembly. Grim reportedly never made another weapon after that, and died a few years later with a troubled mind. The theological implications added another layer of weight. If smithing was semi-divine work associated with creation and transformation, what did it mean that this divine craft was being used to create death tools? Some smiths apparently grappled with this contradiction. They were engaged in work that echoed the creative power of gods while simultaneously serving destruction and ending life. The religious and philosophical tension had no easy resolution. Not all smiths were troubled by this, of course. Some apparently took pride in creating effective weapons, viewing themselves as serving their society's martial culture. Some saw weapon making as simply a craft like any other, no more morally fraught than making ploughs. The psychological impact varied based on individual disposition, personal experiences, and religious views. But for those who did feel the weight of their creation's purpose, there was no therapy, no moral support system, no way to process what we might now recognise as moral injury or vicarious trauma. The modern debates about ethical responsibility in weapons manufacturing, about whether engineers and craftspeople bear responsibility for how their creations are used, have ancient roots. The Viking Age smith who made a sword that killed was grappling with the same questions we still struggle with. Am I responsible for the violence enabled by my craft? Does skill in making death tools make me complicit in death? Can I separate my craftsmanship from the purposes it serves? These questions had no satisfying answers then, and they still don't now. But the smith had to live with them, carrying the knowledge that his life's work was measured in implements of death, that his masterpieces were tools for ending human life, and that somewhere, multiple times, something he made had been used to kill. Chapter 24. The Final Fire. Death in the workshop. For many smiths, the workshop that had been their life's domain became their place of death. The occupational hazards that had threatened them daily finally claimed them, burned to death in fires they couldn't escape, collapsed from heat exhaustion or heart failure beside their forges, overcome by toxic fumes, killed by accidents with molten metal or falling tools. The workshop was both workplace and trap. the site of their craft and often their final resting place. Workshop fires were among the most horrific ways to die. When a smithy caught fire, the intensity of the blaze was extreme. Remember, there was already a forge burning at extreme temperatures, flammable materials everywhere, often wooden structure. If a smith was inside when fire spread beyond the forge, escape routes could be cut off within seconds. The smoke would disorient, the heat would be unbearable, the flames would spread with terrifying speed. Some smiths died trapped in their own workshops, unable to reach the door, overcome by smoke or consumed by flames. Archaeological evidence from burned workshop sites sometimes includes human remains. One particularly well-documented Norwegian site from the late 10th century shows a workshop destroyed by catastrophic fire with skeletal remains of an adult male found near what was the forge location. The position and condition of the remains suggest the individual was alive when the fire started and died trying to escape or combat it. The heat had been sufficient to partially melt some bronze items in the workshop. The smith had literally been incinerated in his own forge fire. Heat exhaustion and cardiac events claimed others. Working in extreme heat for extended periods put enormous strain on the cardiovascular system. For older smiths, for those with pre-existing health problems, for anyone pushed past their physical limits by economic desperation or demanding commissions, the heat stress could be fatal. The heart would simply give out. The smith collapsing beside the forge, his body unable to handle the thermal load any longer. Some were found days later when someone came looking for them, their bodies beside the cold forge, their final work unfinished. Toxic fume exposure occasionally caused acute deaths rather than the chronic poisoning that killed more slowly. Certain metalworking processes could release particularly dangerous fumes. A smith working with zinc-containing materials might be overcome by metal fume fever so severe it proved fatal. Carbon monoxide from insufficient ventilation could cause unconsciousness and death. The smith might breathe normally one moment and collapse the next, dead before anyone realised something was wrong. Accidents provided other fatal possibilities. Molten metal spills could cause horrific burns. If enough metal was involved, the burns could be immediately fatal, or cause death from shock and infection in the days following. Tools falling from storage could crush or kill. The smith working tired, his reflexes slowed, his judgment impaired, might make a fatal mistake, fumbling a piece of hot metal that fell onto his foot or leg, causing burns that led to infection that led to death. Every day presented dozens of ways to die, and eventually for many smiths one of those possibilities became reality. What makes these deaths particularly poignant is how ordinary they were. The smith who died in his workshop wasn't dying in battle or on some grand adventure. He was dying at work, doing the same tasks he'd done thousands of times before. There was no glory, no dramatic narrative, just the final termination of a life spent in smoke and fire and brutal labour. The workshop that had consumed his health over decades finally consumed him entirely. Some smiths apparently chose death in their workshops rather than face alternatives they found worse. The smith facing economic ruin, dishonour from a failed commission, or simply exhaustion from decades of brutal work might decide to end his life in the space that had defined it. Self-immolation in the forge fire was apparently not unheard of, though documentation is fragmentary. The smith would enter his workshop, stoke the fire high, and simply not emerge. Whether this was seen as honourable or shameful likely varied by community and circumstance. Burial practices for smiths sometimes included their tools, suggesting the workshop and craft were seen as integral to identity even in death. One particularly rich burial from Sweden includes a full set of smithing tools: anvil, hammers, tongs, files, buried with what skeletal analysis confirms was a man who showed the characteristic occupational markers of a metal worker. He was buried with the instruments of his craft and his suffering. The tools that had damaged his body, destroyed his hearing, scarred his hands, poisoned his lungs, these accompanied him into death. markers of a life spent in service to metal and fire. So the workshop was birth and death for many smiths, the place where they came of age as craftsmen, where they spent their productive years, and where they finally died. The beautiful objects they created there outlasted them by centuries, preserved in bogs and burials and hoards. But the smiths themselves died ordinary deaths in workshops that are now archaeological sites, their bones showing the damage their craft inflicted, their stories mostly lost, remembered only as another name in a genealogy or a skeleton in an excavation report. Chapter 25. The Legacy of Scars, What Remains. We've now spent over 2 hours examining every brutal aspect of the Viking Age weapon Smith's existence. We've looked at the toxic forge environment, the crushing economic pressure, the physical destruction, the psychological burdens, the social vulnerabilities, the occupational hazards that made their lives exercises in prolonged suffering. And now, as we approach the end of this journey, it's worth considering what all of this means. What remains when we step back and contemplate the full human cost behind the artifacts we admire. When you see a Viking sword in a museum, behind glass, under carefully controlled lighting with a placard describing its probable date and provenance, you're looking at the final product of a system that consumed human beings. That beautiful pattern-welded blade with its elegant proportions represents perhaps 200 hours of brutal labour. It represents thousands of hammer strikes that damaged the smith's shoulders and hands. It represents weeks of breathing toxic smoke that scarred his lungs. It represents economic desperation that drove him to accept the commission despite knowing the cost. It represents the possibility that he was never fully paid for his work. It represents a human life spent in service to metal. The sword you're admiring was forged by hands that were scarred beyond recognition, by a man whose hearing was destroyed, whose eyesight was failing, whose lungs were compromised, whose body was prematurely aged by his craft. It was made with charcoal that required trees to be cut and burned, often by slaves or desperately poor workers dying of smoke exposure. It was made from iron that was harvested from bogs by labourers who sometimes drowned in the process. Every step of its creation involved human suffering we've forgotten. What makes this particularly troubling is how we've romanticised this suffering. We talk about master craftsmen and skilled artisans as if these were comfortable positions of respect and security. We admire the craftsmanship without acknowledging the brutal conditions that produced it. We collect Viking weapons, we study them, we marvel at the skill involved. But we've sanitised the story, removed the suffering, turned it into a narrative of artistic achievement rather than human exploitation and occupational destruction. The irony is profound. The Viking Age smiths who we should honour for their genuine skill and dedication have been simultaneously romanticised and forgotten. We've kept their products while erasing their suffering. We've preserved the swords while losing the names of most who made them. The anonymous craftsmen whose work fills museums are honoured in the abstract while their specific stories, their individual struggles, their particular suffering has been completely lost. We know the artefacts intimately. We've studied their metallurgy, catalogued their typology, traced their influence, but we don't know the people who made them. Modern blacksmiths and historical recreationists who practice traditional techniques with proper safety equipment, ventilation, protective gear, and the ability to stop whenever they choose have gained new appreciation for what ancient smiths endured. Working for even a few hours with hot metal, even with all modern protections, gives a tiny glimpse of how brutal the work was. And then imagining doing that work for 12 hours a day in a poorly ventilated wooden structure with no protective equipment, while economically desperate, while breathing smoke and metal fumes, while knowing you'll probably be dead or disabled by 50, the full reality becomes almost inconceivable. The archaeological evidence of Smith's remains tells the story their names cannot. The skeletal markers of repetitive stress, the signs of metal poisoning, the damage to joints and bones, the evidence of respiratory disease. These are the physical record of their suffering. these bones belong to humans who had hopes and fears, who loved people, who took pride in their work despite its cost, who endured because they had no choice. They aren't abstract historical figures. They were people whose bodies tell stories of pain we're only now learning to read. So what remains? Beautiful objects, certainly. Museum collections, private treasures, archaeological finds. The swords remain, the axes remain. The spear points and knife blades and decorative metalwork remain. But what should also remain is the memory of the cost. When we admire Viking craftsmanship, we should remember the craftsmen, not the romanticised versions, but the real humans who sacrificed their health, their bodies, their futures to create beauty and function from fire and metal. We should remember that every artefact represents suffering we've forgotten, that the price of these objects was paid in human flesh and human lives. The Viking Age weaponsmiths deserve to be remembered not as legendary master craftsmen of some glorious past, but as workers who endured brutal conditions, who were exploited by their economic system, who suffered occupational hazards that we now prevent through regulation and protection, who had no safety net and no justice when things went wrong. They deserve our respect not for achieving some romantic ideal of craftsmanship, but for surviving as long as they did in circumstances that would break most modern people almost immediately. The legacy of scars remains in the artefacts themselves if we choose to see it. Every sword is a record of suffering. Every beautifully crafted object is a monument to human endurance in the face of brutal working conditions. The scars are there. We've just stopped looking for them. But now, perhaps, having spent these hours examining the reality behind the romance, we can see Viking Age metalwork differently. Not as mere artefacts of a past age, but as physical evidence of human cost, as reminders that the past was never as glorious as we imagine, and that the workers who built what we admire deserve to be remembered for their suffering, not just their skill. And so we've reached what might seem like the end of our journey through the smoke-filled workshops of Viking Age Scandinavia. We've examined 25 different aspects of the weaponsmith's existence, each one revealing another layer of difficulty, another dimension of suffering that we rarely consider when we admire their work in museums or read about Norse culture in books. We've stood in the scorching heat of the forge and felt the toxic smoke burn our lungs. We've watched apprentice boys learn their trade through pain and deliberate burns. We've seen smiths go blind from staring at white-hot metal, go deaf from the endless ringing of hammer on anvil, go mad from the repetitive strain and psychological weight of their craft. We've witnessed the economic desperation that kept them working despite the cost, the violent clients they had to appease, the competitive sabotage from rivals, the religious burden of quasi-divine work used for death-making. We've explored how the environmental cost extended far beyond the workshop, forests cleared for charcoal, bogs disturbed for iron, slaves dying in the extraction process. We've seen how female smiths and widows faced double difficulties, navigating all the occupational hazards plus systematic prejudice and accusations of witchcraft. We've contemplated the psychological weight of creating instruments of death, of knowing your work would be used to kill, perhaps killing people you knew. And we've seen how these smiths ended, dying in their workshops from fire or toxic fumes or simple exhaustion, their bodies destroyed by decades of brutal labour, their hands twisted into permanent tool-holding positions, their lungs corrupted beyond function. We've seen how they left behind beautiful artefacts and forgotten suffering, how their names were lost while their swords survived, how we've romanticised their craft while forgetting their pain. The picture that emerges from all of this is of a profession that was essential to Viking Age society, but brutally destructive to those who practiced it. The smiths were valued for their output, but not protected from the hazards of producing it. They were respected in the abstract, but economically exploited in practice. They created objects of genuine beauty and skill, while their own bodies were systematically destroyed by the very work that made those objects possible. This is the reality behind the romance. This is the human cost of the artifacts we admire. And remembering this cost, refusing to sanitize or romanticize it, is perhaps the only way we can truly honour those anonymous craftsmen whose suffering we've inherited in the form of beautiful swords we'll never swing and tools we'll never use. But before we part for the night, before you drift completely into sleep, there's another dimension worth considering. How this history reflects on our own time, our own relationship with labour and craft, and the human cost of the things we value. It would be comforting to think that the brutal working conditions we've explored tonight are purely historical, that we've progressed beyond such exploitation, that modern workers are protected from the kind of systematic destruction Viking Age smiths endured. And in many ways, we have made progress. We have OSHA regulations, workplace safety standards, workers' compensation, labour unions, environmental protections. The specific horrors of the Viking Age smithy have been largely eliminated in developed nations. Yet when we look honestly at global supply chains, when we consider where our smartphones and clothing and cheap goods actually come from, we see echoes of the same patterns. Someone, somewhere, is paying the physical price for the objects we consume. The cobalt miner in the Congo breathing toxic dust, the garment worker in Bangladesh in a building with inadequate fire exits, the electronics assembly worker exposed to industrial chemicals, the agricultural labourer suffering pesticide exposure. The suffering has been moved, made less visible, attributed to developing nations, or unfortunate but necessary conditions. But it hasn't ended. We've simply gotten better at hiding the human cost from the end consumer. The Viking Age warrior who commissioned a sword might hear stories about the smith's ruined hands or damaged lungs. The distance between creation and consumption was minimal. You knew who made your weapon. You might know something about their life and struggles. But when you purchase a smartphone, you have no idea who mined the rare earth elements, who assembled the components, what conditions they endured. The supply chain is so long and complex that the suffering becomes invisible, abstract, someone else's problem. The environmental cost has similarly been externalised. The Viking Age community that exhausted local forest for charcoal production faced immediate consequences. They had to move or adapt or import fuel from elsewhere. The environmental destruction was visible and local, but modern manufacturing spreads its environmental damage globally, making it harder to see the connection between consumption and consequence. The rare earth mining that devastates landscapes happens far from where the products are consumed. The carbon emissions that drive climate change are distributed across the entire atmosphere. We've made the cost harder to attribute, easier to ignore. This isn't to say nothing has improved. It manifestly has for many workers in many places, but the underlying pattern persists. Beautiful or useful objects are produced at human and environmental cost that's systematically hidden from those who benefit from them. We've replaced one-on-one exploitation with systems so complex that responsibility becomes diffused, blame becomes impossible to assign, and suffering becomes invisible to consumers who would be horrified if they truly understood the price others paid for their convenience. Perhaps that's the real lesson from examining the Viking Age smith suffering. Not that things were worse then and better now, but that we have a persistent tendency to value objects more than the people who make them, to admire craftsmanship while forgetting craftsmen, to enjoy the benefits of labour while ignoring its costs. Yet even this isn't quite the end of our reflection. There's something else worth considering as you settle deeper into comfort, as sleep approaches. Consider for a moment the comfort you're experiencing right now. You're lying in a bed, or sitting in a chair, in a temperature-controlled environment. You're not breathing toxic smoke. Your hands aren't scarred. Your lungs aren't corrupted. You can hear these words without difficulty. You can see properly. Your body isn't being systematically destroyed by your work. You have labour protections, safety regulations, the option to stop working if conditions become intolerable. These comforts aren't accidents. They're the result of centuries of labour movements, of workers organising and fighting, and sometimes dying to establish basic protections. The 8-hour workday, the weekend, workplace safety requirements, child labour laws, minimum wage, workers' compensation. None of these existed for the Viking Age smith, and none of them came into existence easily in our own time. People fought for these protections, suffered for them, sacrificed for them. So there's something to be grateful for in this history of suffering. Not grateful for the suffering itself, but grateful for what we've learned from it, for the protections we've built, for the gradual recognition that workers deserve safety and dignity regardless of the value of what they produce. The Viking Age smith had no advocates, no union, no regulatory agency protecting his interests. Modern workers, at least in many contexts, have inherited protections that would seem miraculous to those ancient craftsmen. This gratitude shouldn't breed complacency. There's still enormous work to be done, still workers suffering, still exploitation to fight against. But it can breed appreciation for progress that's been made and determination to continue making it. The smiths who suffered so we could inherit their artifacts deserve that their suffering means something, that we learn from it, that we refuse to let similar suffering continue when we have the power to prevent it. And now, truly, we're approaching the end of our time together tonight. The fire in the ancient forge has long since gone cold. The smoke has dissipated. The hammer has stopped ringing. It's time to rest. Picture, if you will, a Viking Age smithy at the end of the day. The smith has banked the forge fire, covering the coals so they'll stay alive until morning but won't pose a danger overnight. The tools have been put away. The workspace, never truly clean, has been tidied as much as it ever is. The smith steps out of his workshop into the cool evening air, his lungs grateful for the change, his body exhausted from 12 hours of brutal labour. The sun is setting over the Scandinavian landscape, perhaps over Norwegian fjords, or Swedish forests, or Danish coastlines. The light is that particular quality of northern sunset, soft and extended, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose. The smith's hands ache, his shoulders throb, his ears ring with the phantom echo of the day's hammering. But for this moment, the work is done. For this moment he can breathe air that isn't thick with smoke. For this moment he can rest. He doesn't know that 1,000 years from now someone will lie in comfort and learn about his life, will spend hours contemplating his struggles, will try to honour his memory by refusing to romanticise his suffering. He doesn't know that his tools will be excavated and studied, that his workshop will become an archaeological site, that scholars will examine his bones and read the story of his pain in his skeleton's damage. He knows only that he's tired, that tomorrow will bring more of the same, that this is his life and he has no choice but to endure it. But you, dear listener, you have choices those ancient smiths never had. You can choose to rest comfortably. You can choose to remember their suffering while being grateful for your own protections. You can choose to honour their memory not through romantic myth-making, but through honest acknowledgement of the price they paid. As you drift towards sleep now, let the images from tonight settle gently in your mind. The forge fire burning in the darkness, the shower of sparks from hammer on hot metal, the smoke rising through the roof hole, the smith's scarred hands shaping iron. Let these images become softer, less distinct, fading like the light of that ancient sunset. Let the details blur and merge. Let the story dissolve into the approaching dream. The Viking Age smiths are long dead. Their workshops are ruins or archaeological sites. Their forges are cold. Their hammers are silent. The suffering we've explored tonight ended centuries ago for those specific individuals. But their work remains. In museums, in private collections, in burial sites yet to be discovered. And now their stories remain too, at least a little bit, in your awareness as you drift towards sleep. Tomorrow you'll wake in comfort they couldn't imagine. You'll go about your day without breathing toxic smoke or risking your life at work or facing economic ruin from a single mistake. The protections you enjoy, the safety you experience, the dignity you're granted, these represent progress, genuine progress, however incomplete it remains. Honour that progress by remembering what came before, by refusing to romanticize past suffering, by working toward a world where no one's labour systematically destroys their body. But tonight, simply rest. Let the history settle. Let the weight of all that suffering be something you've witnessed and honoured but don't have to carry into sleep. The ancient smiths would want you to rest comfortably, to enjoy the peace they rarely experienced, to sleep well in ways they often couldn't. Their suffering is over. Yours doesn't need to begin. Simply rest. If you found value in this journey through forgotten history, if learning about the human cost behind beautiful artifacts resonated with you, consider subscribing to Boring History. There are many more stories of forgotten workers, overlooked suffering, and sanitized histories to explore. But that's for another night. For now, simply close your eyes. The forge fire burns low, the smoke clears, the hammer falls silent, the work is done. Sleep well, dear listener, sleep well. And perhaps, as you drift away, spare one last thought for the anonymous smiths, whose hands created beauty through suffering, whose names are forgotten, but whose legacy remains in every Viking artifact we admire. Good night.